Hello, my dear friends. Giving birth in medieval times was not only a moment of welcoming life, but also a step into a life-or-death gamble. Inside a closed room, where dim light filtered through the cracks of the door, the mother struggled with pain while surrounded by strange rituals and harsh rules. Every object, every vow, every action was believed to decide the fate of mother and child. There are things that sound fantastic today, but at that time, they were common sense. Tonight, you will step into that world to witness it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now we dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever thought that a medieval bride could ease slowly into her new life, you would be far from the reality most women faced. In many households, the duty of producing a child began almost as soon as the wedding feast ended. A wife stepped into her husband's home with the expectation that she would give the family an heir without delay. For noble families, every month without a pregnancy was seen as a risk to the future of the title, the estate, and the family's political strength. In rural homes, the urgency was no less real, though the reason was simpler. More children meant more hands to work the land and a stronger chance of survival through harsh seasons. The pressure was unspoken at times, but it was there from the start. The value of a wife was often measured by how quickly she could conceive. A daughter might be received warmly, but a son was the real proof of her worth because he would carry the family name and hold the inheritance. Without a son, her position could remain fragile no matter how well she kept the household or managed its affairs. It is almost amusing that so much of a woman's standing depended on something she could influence only so much, yet she was made entirely accountable for it. Families did not hide their concern. Relatives, neighbours, and even servants might discuss her condition openly, and her body became a subject of public interest within the walls of her home. To improve her chances, the routines of her daily life could be changed in ways that allowed little personal choice. Meals were chosen for their supposed fertility benefits, with warm milk, certain herbs, and rich broths prepared at set times. Heavy labour might be reduced, but her rest and activity hours were decided for her. Older women in the family took charge of her schedule, believing that their guidance could ensure a quick pregnancy. If you compare it to modern times, it was like living under constant supervision by a personal committee, except the goal was not your comfort but the fulfillment of their expectations. In noble homes, these measures could be elaborate, involving physicians or herbalists who prescribed costly treatments and rare ingredients. In rural homes, the methods were less refined but just as controlling. A new wife might work in the fields or tend livestock until she was visibly pregnant, then be reassigned lighter tasks. She was watched closely for signs of fatigue or disobedience to dietary rules. Advice came freely, whether she wanted it or not, and failure to conceive quickly could lead to whispers about her fitness as a wife. In the most extreme cases, the possibility of her husband seeking another partner loomed in the background. For the woman, this was not just a physical expectation, but an emotional strain. The early months of marriage were supposed to be about settling into a new home, yet they were often dominated by subtle reminders of her duty to bear children. Remedies and rituals were passed down through generations. Some were harmless, like wearing charms or placing certain objects near her bed. Others were unpleasant or invasive, involving herbal brews that caused discomfort. In a society without a modern understanding of fertility, these customs carried the weight of truth. Refusing them risked being seen as stubborn or uncooperative. From my perspective, the striking part is how the focus was placed entirely on the goal of conception, with little thought given to the woman's well-being or readiness. When pregnancy was achieved, the change in treatment was immediate. Relief replaced suspicion, and approval from the family was more visible. However, the underlying purpose did not shift. Her success in conceiving was only the first step, and the cycle would begin again after the child's birth, particularly if the child was not a boy. For many women, married life became a rhythm of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, with little time outside those roles. This was reinforced by the nature of medieval marriage itself. In most cases, marriage was as much a business arrangement between families as it was a personal relationship. The wife's body was part of the agreement, and the children were its proof. The concept of delaying motherhood or choosing not to have children simply did not exist within the accepted norms. Traditions were strong, and the influence of elders over the household was nearly absolute. The same rules applied regardless of class. In a manor or a small village, the expectation that a wife would bear children quickly was nearly universal. The difference was only in the resources used to encourage it. A noble woman might drink imported spiced wine and consult learned physicians, while a peasant wife would follow the advice of village elders and use herbs gathered nearby. Yet both lived under the same measure of value their ability to give birth, preferably to sons, and preferably soon. The private impact on the women themselves was rarely acknowledged in public. A bride who could not conceive quickly might be isolated. Her presence at family events reduced, or her voice in household matters diminished. The pressure could extend beyond the immediate family. Neighbours and other members of the community often shared the belief that a wife's purpose was to continue the line. In that climate, even casual interactions could be tinged with judgment. Some women found ways to cope, taking comfort in the company of other wives who shared the same burden. Quiet conversations during market visits or while working in the yard could offer a small sense of solidarity. Yet these moments were brief and did not change the reality that her place in the household depended on her fulfilling the role set for her. For those who could not or did not meet the expectation, the consequences were real. In certain regions, legal or church interventions could dissolve marriages deemed unfruitful, allowing the husband to remarry. Even without formal separation, a wife without children could find herself living on the edges of her household, replaced in importance by younger relatives or by women who had given birth to heirs. When a pregnancy did come, the focus shifted to ensuring a safe birth. A new set of customs and restrictions took over, each designed to protect the unborn child and the mother. These practices were deeply rooted in the same mindset that had driven the urgency to conceive the belief that the future of the family rested on her body and the children it could produce. This transition from the expectation to conceive to the rituals of pregnancy is where the next chapter unfolds. It reveals not only the methods used to guide a pregnancy to term, but also how control over a woman's life deepened once that long-awaited sign of success appeared. When the first signs of pregnancy failed to appear, the attention in a medieval household often shifted from managing a young wife's daily life to pushing her toward remedies and rituals meant to call a child into being. The ideas guiding these actions came from a mixture of local superstition, religious symbolism, and family tradition. These practices were not seen as strange in their own time. They were part of a shared belief that conception could be influenced by deliberate acts, by objects imbued with certain powers, and by the right sequence of ceremonies. For the woman involved, it meant another layer of control over her body, this time wrapped in the language of hope and blessing. One of the most visible customs was the use of charms and talismans. Pieces of bone from specific animals, teeth taken from wolves, or claws from birds of prey were worn on cords around the neck or sewn into small pouches and kept beneath clothing. Families believed these items carried the strength or vitality of the creature they came from, and that their presence could encourage fertility. It is almost amusing that in a time without understanding of biology, the answer to complex questions of conception was thought to hang from a string around the neck. These charms were not simply decorative, they were handled carefully, blessed by local priests or wise women, and sometimes replaced at certain phases of the moon to renew their power. Beyond personal amulets, Some households turned to public or communal rituals. In many regions, springs, wells, or pools were thought to hold sacred qualities. Women hoping for children were taken to these places, sometimes at dawn, sometimes during a festival linked to fertility. The water was considered a direct channel for divine favour, and bathing in it or drinking from it was believed to cleanse the body and prepare it for new life. Families could travel significant distances to reach a particular site known for its blessed water. The ritual might involve walking around the well a set number of times, leaving offerings such as bread or flowers, and then immersing or washing in the water. The act was as much about community belief as it was about the individual woman. Not all remedies were gentle. Some involved consuming mixtures that today would seem unwise or even dangerous. A number of traditions called for blending certain herbs with animal blood to create a tonic meant to call the child into the womb. The exact ingredients varied, but they could include strong-smelling plants, roots considered warming to the body, and the fresh blood of a recently killed animal, often a goat or a bird. The mixture was usually prepared by someone regarded as knowledgeable in such matters, perhaps a village healer or an older female relative. If you think about it in modern terms, it was like following a strict health regimen designed by people who had no access to real medical information, but complete confidence in their methods. These rituals were rarely optional for the woman at the centre of them. Declining to participate could be seen as rejecting the chance to fulfill her duty, and that could damage her standing in the household. Even if she felt no belief in the charms or the ceremonies, the social pressure was strong enough to bring her to the well or to place the amulet around her neck. In some cases, she might even be taken to these places without much explanation, simply told it was for her benefit. There were variations across regions and social classes. In noble households, fertility rituals could be combined with formal blessings from the church, elaborate processions, or the giving of costly gifts to monasteries in exchange for prayers. In rural settings, the approach was more direct and practical, often relying on what could be gathered or made locally. Still, the underlying idea was the same if conception had not happened naturally. It could be encouraged by aligning the woman with symbols and forces thought to be favourable. The psychological effect of these practices was mixed. For some women, participating might have brought a sense of hope or comfort, even if the methods were questionable. For others, it was another reminder that their worth was tied to an outcome they could not entirely control. From my point of view, it is telling that these rituals, no matter how strange they may seem now, were treated as serious responsibilities rather than personal choices. The family's involvement ensured that the process was public, and success or failure was measured and remembered. Many of these rituals were seasonal, tied to planting or harvest times. When the cycles of the earth were seen as connected to human fertility, it was common for women to be advised to attempt conception at specific points in the year, and rituals might be timed accordingly. This added another layer of structure to a woman's life, as her most private experiences were linked to the rhythms of the community. There were also beliefs about the conduct of the woman herself during the period when these rituals were in effect. Certain foods were forbidden, certain activities discouraged, and even certain people were avoided for fear of transferring bad luck or illness. A woman might be told not to enter a room where someone had recently died, or to avoid looking at deformed animals. She might be instructed to carry out small acts daily, like lighting a candle at a family altar, or placing a hand on her abdomen after morning prayers. These small, repetitive actions were thought to reinforce the larger ceremonies. The combination of amulets, public rituals, and controlled behaviour created an environment where a woman's life could be dominated by the pursuit of pregnancy. There was little room for questioning whether these methods worked, because the community's collective belief made them unquestionable. Success was attributed to the ritual, and failure meant more effort was needed. Even when pregnancy occurred naturally, the credit could be given to the most recent charm or blessing. The persistence of these practices shows how deeply embedded they were in the fabric of medieval life. They were not isolated superstitions, but part of a network of expectations that guided how families responded to the challenge of childlessness. To step outside them was to risk standing apart from the community's shared understanding of how the world worked. In a time when uncertainty was constant and mortality high, rituals like these gave people a sense of order, even if that order was built on fragile foundations. The transition from these fertility rites to the next stage of pregnancy brought its own set of customs. Once a woman was believed to have conceived, the focus shifted from calling the child to protecting it. That phase, with its strict rules and careful watch over every movement and meal, formed another chapter in the story of how medieval families tried to control life before it even began. In the medieval world, the early weeks of a suspected pregnancy brought a new kind of attention to a woman's body. Without medical tools or accurate tests, families relied on a set of crude methods to decide whether conception had taken place. These methods were shaped by tradition, local superstition, and the limits of the era's knowledge. They were taken seriously, even though they offered little certainty. For the woman, it meant being observed, examined, and sometimes subjected to uncomfortable experiments before she herself might feel sure of the change within her. One of the most common practices was simple visual observation. Older women in the household would watch for shifts in the colour of her skin, changes in the way she moved, and even the set of her facial expression. A pale or glowing complexion could be interpreted as a sign, depending on local belief. Eyes that seemed heavy or brighter than usual might be noted, and the shape of her waistline inspected during routine dressing. Families also believed that pregnancy could be detected by the way a woman breathed. A slower, deeper pattern was taken as evidence. This could lead to awkward moments where her breathing was quietly studied while she worked or sat at the table. It is almost amusing to think how much certainty they placed on such vague and easily misread signs. The scrutiny extended beyond sight and sound to smell. Some believed a woman's scent would subtly change, and this too was noted and discussed. For those who wanted more than observation, there were tests involving plants and herbs. One method placed a small bundle of certain leaves or flowers in a bowl with the woman's urine, then waited to see if the plant changed colour, wilted quickly, or gave off a particular smell. These reactions were thought to reveal the presence of new life. The specific plants used varied by region. Some favoured barley or wheat seeds, believing that faster sprouting when watered with a woman's urine indicated pregnancy. Others used strong-scented herbs, expecting that certain changes in aroma could give a clear answer. While these methods sound more like folk magic than science, they were respected enough to be repeated generation after generation. If you compare it to modern times, it was like performing a laboratory test without instruments, training, or even a clear idea of what you were measuring. Dreams also held diagnostic weight. If a woman dreamed of holding a child, picking fruit, or seeing certain animals, these were treated as messages about her condition. Dreams involving water, especially calm, clear water, were considered positive signs. Relatives might gather to hear her describe her dreams and then offer their interpretations. Some women learned to shape their storytelling to encourage a favourable conclusion, especially if they were under pressure to conceive. A dream could not prove pregnancy, but in an environment where hope mattered as much as fact, it could strengthen belief and reduce suspicion. From my perspective, this reliance on dreams says more about the community's need for reassurance than about the accuracy of their methods. These practices were often layered together. A woman might be observed for physical changes, tested with plants, and questioned about her dreams all within the same week. The combined results would form the family's opinion. If the signs were seen as positive, pregnancy preparations could begin immediately. This could mean changes to her work schedule, alterations to her diet, and the introduction of protective charms around her living space. If the results were inconclusive or negative, more rituals might be tried to encourage conception, and the scrutiny would continue. The process could be intrusive. A woman's privacy was minimal, and her body became a public matter within the household. While some may have accepted this as part of life, others surely felt the weight of constant evaluation. In noble families, the stakes were higher because an heir's arrival was not just a private joy, but a matter of political stability. The involvement of physicians or clergy could add further layers of examination, though their methods were often no more reliable than those of village elders. For women in rural settings, the same lack of privacy existed, though the social circle was smaller. Neighbours and relatives might exchange opinions about her condition, and her absence from certain tasks could fuel speculation. Even her movements in public, how she walked, how much she carried, whether she appeared tired could become part of the diagnosis in the eyes of those around her. These crude methods of detection also shaped the emotional landscape of early pregnancy. False positives could lead to weeks of preparation and expectation, only to end in disappointment when menstruation returned. False negatives could delay care or protection at a critical stage. Yet the community's willingness to trust these signs shows how strong the link was between tradition and the management of women's reproductive lives. In this environment, the woman's voice carried little weight. Even if she felt certain she was pregnant, the household's belief depended on its own chosen tests. Conversely, if she suspected she was not, the signs others thought they saw might outweigh her knowledge of her body. The balance of authority lay firmly with the observers, not the observed. Once the household agreed a pregnancy was likely, the next phase began. Attention shifted from diagnosis to protection. Her routine would change, her activities limited, and a new set of customs would guide her days. These measures were intended to safeguard both mother and child, but they also deepened the control exerted over her life. That stage, with its strict rules and symbolic acts, formed the next chapter in the long journey from marriage to motherhood in the medieval world. In the medieval world, once a pregnancy was believed to be certain, a new set of rules began to shape a woman's daily life. These were not gentle suggestions. They were strict prohibitions rooted in fear, symbolism, and inherited custom. The aim, at least in the minds of those enforcing them, was to protect both the mother and the unborn child from harm. Without modern medicine, people turned to a system of taboos that blended superstition and community belief. For the woman, it meant another narrowing of freedom, with her movements, her diet, and even her gaze brought under control. One of the most widely held prohibitions was against looking at the dead. It was believed that seeing a corpse could pass an invisible corruption onto the living child. The term amvia, or being touched by the spirit of the dead, described the fear that the soul of the deceased could disturb the balance of life within the womb. Funerals were avoided, even for close relatives, and pregnant women might be steered away from streets where a body was being carried to burial. This restriction could be deeply isolating, as it removed her from important communal rituals. It is almost amusing how the same people who urged her to be a central figure in family life could also insist she hide from it, at moments they considered dangerous. The same logic applied to places associated with death in a more public and violent form. Sites of execution, gallows, and scaffolds were seen as deeply dangerous for an expectant mother. Passing near them was thought to invite bad spirits, or the restless energy of those who had died unwillingly. Public executions, which were community events for many, were strictly off limits. A pregnant woman might be kept inside if the crowd was gathering nearby, not just to avoid the sight but to prevent her from breathing in what was considered tainted air. Avoiding these spaces was meant to guard the child from inheriting a troubled spirit or a doomed fate. If you compare it to modern times, it was like banning someone from entire streets or neighborhoods simply because of what had once happened there. Food, too, was carefully monitored, and certain items were completely forbidden. Among these were fruits with seeds. The belief was that eating them could cause a blockage in the womb, making birth difficult or even impossible. This idea came from the visible hardness and size of seeds, which people imagined could physically interfere with the developing child. Grapes, pomegranates, and certain melons were avoided entirely. even if they were otherwise common in the household. In some regions, the rule was extended to nuts and legumes, further narrowing the woman's diet. From my perspective, these restrictions show how physical fears and symbolic thinking were merged into one set of rules that could override common sense. These taboos were not optional. They were enforced by family members, neighbours, and sometimes by the broader community. Older women in the household often took on the role of guardian, reminding the pregnant woman of what she could and could not do. If she broke a rule, even accidentally, it could lead to whispered worries about the baby's health or open criticism about her carelessness. The constant watchfulness meant that every step outside her room could feel monitored. The list of prohibitions could extend far beyond the three most commonly remembered ones. Some communities believed a pregnant woman should not look at animals giving birth, in case the sight brought pain to her labour. Others forbade her from standing in doorways, which were thought to trap the flow of life. Even sitting in certain chairs could be avoided if someone claimed a stillbirth had happened to a previous occupant. The effect was a gradual shrinking of her safe spaces, both physically and socially. In noble households, the restrictions might be formalised into a set of rules that were known to the entire staff. Servants were instructed to keep her away from certain areas of the castle or manor. Foods deemed unsafe were removed from kitchens entirely to prevent mistakes. The woman's chambers might be rearranged to avoid objects with negative associations, and visitors were screened for recent exposure to death or illness. In rural homes, the enforcement was more direct and personal, with family members stepping in to block her path or remove an offending item from her hands. The prohibitions also influenced her mental world. She became aware that her every action, and even her gaze, could be interpreted as having consequences for the child. While some women may have found reassurance in the structure of these rules, others must have felt trapped by them. The inability to attend a funeral for a loved one, or to walk freely through her village, could deepen her sense of separation from normal life. There was also the matter of compliance. Many women likely followed the rules without question, having grown up with the same beliefs. Others may have quietly doubted them but lacked the power to resist. The cost of open defiance was too high, as any complication in pregnancy or birth could be blamed on her failure to observe the taboos. This gave the rules a kind of self-reinforcing power. No one wanted to be the one held responsible if something went wrong. The practical effects of these taboos on the health of the mother and child were minimal or non-existent, but they shaped the social experience of pregnancy in profound ways. They marked a woman as different, set apart from others, and placed her under a system of control that extended beyond her wishes. In the eyes of her community, these rules were acts of care, yet they were also tools of restriction. Once these prohibitions were in place, they would remain until the child was born. Only then could she move freely, attend public gatherings, and eat without second-guessing every bite. Until that moment, her life moved within a carefully defined boundary, drawn not by walls but by the invisible lines of belief. The transition from the constraints of pregnancy to the preparations for birth brought its shift in focus, as the household turned from protecting the unborn child to ensuring the mother's survival in the dangerous days ahead. That stage of her journey carried its customs and its own pressures, and it would be the next step in the long sequence that defined her role. In the weeks after a pregnancy was believed to be certain, the focus in many medieval households shifted from restrictions and taboos to active supervision. The idea was that a mother-to-be required constant watch, not only for her safety, but for the well-being of the unborn child. This was not a casual arrangement. A specific person was chosen to take on the role of guardian, living with or near the pregnant woman and observing her closely from morning until night. This guardian might be a trusted female relative, an experienced household servant, or a midwife hired to remain in the home until the birth. In noble families, the decision was made with careful thought. A midwife who had attended several births in the family could be chosen because she already understood the customs of the household. She would be given access to the private rooms of the expectant mother and the authority to enforce rules. Her tasks went beyond healthcare. She was expected to manage the woman's routine, oversee her meals, and keep her from any action that might be judged as harmful. It is almost amusing how a woman could be declared the most precious person in the house, while being treated as though she had no judgment of her own. Every choice, from what she ate to when she rested, could pass through the guardian's approval. A key duty of this attendant was to monitor and record any changes in the woman's body and behaviour. In large households, the notes might be written and stored with other domestic records. They could include observations about appetite, skin tone, mood, and patterns of sleep or movement. In smaller homes, the guardian might report verbally to senior family members, especially to the woman's mother-in-law. In modern life, it would be like living with someone who keeps a running diary of your personal habits and shares it with your boss. These records, whether written or spoken, shape the household's decisions about the woman's activities and sometimes even about the timing of rituals meant to protect her pregnancy. The guardian's responsibilities included direct intervention whenever the pregnant woman attempted something seen as risky. This could mean removing an object from her hands, urging her to sit and rest, or guiding her away from a place believed to be unsafe. Forbidden acts ranged from lifting heavy buckets to walking long distances or eating food thought to carry bad luck. From my perspective, this combination of help and authority shows how easily care can be used as a way to control someone. In many cases, the guardian's authority was backed by the head of the household, leaving the pregnant woman with little room to refuse. In wealthy homes, the guardian often acted as a gatekeeper for visitors. Friends, relatives, and even other servants needed approval before they could enter the pregnant woman's chambers. The stated reason was to protect her from illness, but the rule also allowed the guardian to control her social contact. In rural villages, the same role existed in a less formal way. An older woman might arrive unannounced to check on the expectant mother, give advice, and ensure she was following all the expected customs. For the pregnant woman, this watchful presence could be both a source of comfort and a burden. Knowing that someone was always nearby might ease her fears, but it also meant she lived with almost no privacy. Her personal choices were often overridden, and her opinions on what she could manage physically might be dismissed. In disputes, the guardian's word was usually final, especially if older family members supported her. The guardian herself carried significant pressure. A healthy birth would reflect well on her abilities, while any complication could draw suspicion or blame. This risk encouraged her to enforce every rule strictly, even if it meant limiting the woman's independence more than necessary. In some cases, if the guardian proved her capability, she could continue serving the family after the birth, helping care for the newborn and advising the mother during recovery. In noble households, the guardian's work often included coordination with physicians and preparation for the delivery. She might manage supplies of clean linens, herbal remedies, and oils, ensuring everything was ready weeks in advance. She might also arrange for religious blessings or protective charms to be placed in the woman's room. In rural homes, the tasks were simpler but no less important, often involving the preparation of herbal teas, the maintenance of warmth and cleanliness in the living space, and constant nighttime watch. Regardless of wealth or class, the presence of a guardian reflected the same belief pregnancy was a shared responsibility and a matter of public interest within the family. The woman's body was not regarded as her private domain. It was managed and observed by others, shaped by tradition, and reinforced by generations of practice. For some women, this could bring reassurance in a time when childbirth was dangerous. For others, it was a constant reminder that their independence was secondary to the expectations placed upon them. As the pregnancy advanced, the level of supervision often increased. The guardian might limit the woman's movements even further, insisting she remain indoors or spend more time resting. Visitors could be reduced to only the most trusted relatives. Meals might be adjusted to match beliefs about the final stages of pregnancy. Every sign of fatigue or discomfort was noted and discussed with the family. By the last weeks, the guardian's control could extend into every corner of the woman's life. leaving her with little more than the role of patient in her own home. The system was presented as care, but it also served to reinforce the structure of authority in the household. It placed the pregnant woman under a single figure who answered to the family elders rather than to her. This ensured that the family's rules and traditions took priority over her personal preferences. Even moments of kindness or genuine concern were framed within the expectation that she must comply for the sake of the child and the honour of the household. In the final days before birth, the guardian's presence would become even more constant. She might sleep in the same room, prepare the birthing area, and keep a steady watch for signs of labour. The transition from pregnancy supervision to managing the birth was seamless, and for the woman, it meant moving from one controlled environment directly into another. The household saw this as necessary to ensure a safe delivery, but it also meant the pregnant woman never experienced a moment when her life was entirely her own. The role of the guardian ended only after the birth and the initial recovery period. By then, the patterns of control were so established that they could continue in new forms, shaping how the mother cared for her child and how she was allowed to resume her duties. In this way, the position of the guardian was more than a temporary measure. It was part of a larger tradition that defined how pregnancy and motherhood were handled in the medieval world, a tradition that blended care with control and left little room for personal choice. By the time the final weeks of pregnancy arrived, the focus of the household shifted from constant supervision of the mother-to-be to preparing the space where the birth would take place. This preparation was not done casually. In many medieval households, it took on the weight and structure of a sacred ritual. Every object brought into the room, every scent that filled the air, and every surface that could be seen or touched was thought to influence the safety of the mother and child. One of the first acts was the placing of protective charms on the doors and windows of the room. These charms could take different forms depending on local custom and family belief. In some places, it was a small carved figure tied with a strip of cloth. In others, a twisted cord knotted in a certain pattern. The purpose was always the same, to block any malevolent force from entering. The irony is that the greatest threat to childbirth in those days was not evil spirits, but the lack of clean conditions and proper medical care. Still, the fear of unseen dangers was so strong that no family would risk leaving the room unguarded. Once the charms were in place, the next step was to prepare the air. This meant burning incense or certain dried herbs, chosen for their scent and their supposed power to drive away harmful influences. Sage, rosemary, and juniper were common, though some regions used more unusual plants, passed down through generations of midwives. The smoke curled upward and lingered, giving the room a heavy, distinct smell that marked it as ready for the event to come. If this were done in a modern home, the effect would probably be mistaken for setting up a themed relaxation spa. In the medieval mind, though, it was a shield against danger, as essential as food or water. Mirrors and other reflective surfaces were treated with special caution. It was widely believed that a newborn soul, still unsteady and easily influenced, could be drawn into a mirror's reflection and trapped there. To prevent this, every mirror in the room was covered with cloth, and any polished metal that might reflect light was hidden away. This practice sometimes extended to covering glass panes or removing bowls of water from the space. I find it striking how much effort was put into controlling not just what entered the room, but what the room itself could reveal. The furnishings were arranged with care. The bed for the mother was placed in a position that allowed the midwife to move freely around it, yet kept her head facing in what was considered a lucky direction. Additional stools, benches, and cushions were set nearby for attendants. Warm blankets were prepared and folded at the foot of the bed. A small table held whatever tools and supplies the midwife expected to need, from cloths for cleaning to jars of herbal ointments. Lighting was another consideration. In winter, candles were set so their light fell softly and did not cast deep shadows, which were thought to attract misfortune. In summer, windows were partly covered to filter the sunlight. The idea was to create an environment that was neither too bright nor too dim, balancing comfort with symbolic protection. The preparation often included a small space for prayer or blessing. In Christian households, this might be a crucifix or a saint's image placed where the mother could see it. In other traditions, it might be a set of charms or an altar for offerings. These items were believed to call on divine help for a safe delivery. Once the physical space was arranged, the household turned to the flow of people in and out of the room. Only those directly involved in the birth were allowed to remain during labour. Visitors could bring bad news, bad luck, or simply a distraction. This control of entry was part of the ritual, reinforcing the idea that the birthing room was a separate world, sealed off from everyday life until the child arrived safely. In noble homes, the preparations could be elaborate. Fine linens embroidered with protective symbols might be brought out, and fresh flowers arranged to sweeten the air. In rural homes, the steps were simpler, but no less deliberate. Even in the smallest cottage, the charms, the smoke of burning herbs, and the careful covering of mirrors would mark the transformation of an ordinary room into a space for one of life's most dangerous and important moments. The ritual of preparing the birthing room served more than one purpose. It calmed the household, giving everyone clear tasks to complete, and it reassured the mother that all possible measures had been taken. At the same time, it reflected a deep belief in the connection between the spiritual world and the physical body. Childbirth was not seen as a purely natural process. It was a crossing point between life and death, watched over by forces both visible and unseen. In some regions, the preparations continued until the very onset of labour. If signs of trouble appeared, new charms could be added, stronger incense burned, or additional prayers said. In this way, the room was not just prepared once, but continually adjusted to keep it in harmony with the needs of the moment. The symbolism of these acts endured long after the birth. Some families kept the charms used in the room as keepsakes, believing they retained a protective influence. Others would burn them in a final act meant to release any lingering danger. The smoke from this burning was thought to seal the event and protect the mother and child as they moved forward into everyday life. While the practical impact of these rituals on the safety of childbirth was minimal, their effect on the emotions of those involved was significant. They offered structure in a time of uncertainty and a sense of control in a process that could quickly turn dangerous. The birthing room became not just a physical space, but a container for hope, fear, and tradition. As the final days before birth drew near, the room stood ready, every charm hung in its place, every surface arranged just so, the air carrying the layered scent of herbs and incense. For the mother-to-be, stepping into this prepared space was like stepping into a stage set for the most intense scene of her life. The guardian who had watched her for months would now stand ready beside her, and the midwife would take her position. The moment of waiting was almost over, and the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Once the birthing room had been arranged and all the charms, scents, and protections were in place, attention turned to the objects that would be directly used during labour. These were not simply laid out on a whim. Each item had a practical role and a place in the long tradition of childbirth. The most central of these was the birthing chair. Unlike ordinary chairs, the birthing chair was made specifically for the demands of labour. It was usually crafted from sturdy wood, with a wide seat and a large circular opening in the middle. This design allowed the midwife to work from below while the mother sat, supported on all sides. Some chairs had armrests carved with smooth curves for the mother to grip, while others had simple flat sides. The legs were often short and solid to keep the chair stable during the most intense moments. It is remarkable that such a simple design, which might look crude by modern standards, was actually the product of generations of practical refinement. In wealthier households, the birthing chair might be polished and decorated, perhaps with carvings of protective symbols or inlaid patterns. In poorer homes, it was plain, perhaps borrowed from another family or quickly assembled by a local carpenter. Regardless of appearance, the function remained the same. The chair was positioned in a way that allowed light to fall evenly on the mother and the midwife's working area, without casting sharp shadows. Alongside the chair, there was often a rope or wooden bar suspended from the ceiling or mounted across the room. The mother could hold this to help her balance and bear down during contractions. In some cases, it was a thick braided cord, worn smooth from use in many births. In others, it was a polished wooden beam, secured firmly so it would not move. Holding on to this gave the mother something solid to focus on and provided leverage during the hardest pushes. If you walked into such a room today without knowing its purpose, you might mistake it for a strange piece of exercise equipment. The midwife also kept a supply of oils or animal fats for lubrication. These were stored in small clay or metal containers, sometimes warmed before use. The scent varied depending on the source. Some were mild, while others carried a strong, earthy aroma. The purpose was to ease the passage of the baby and reduce tearing. The use of these substances was both a matter of tradition and necessity, especially in a time when surgical intervention was dangerous and often avoided unless absolutely necessary. Cloths of different sizes were stacked nearby. Some were for cleaning the mother, others for wrapping the newborn. These might be made of linen or wool, depending on what was available. In wealthier settings, they were sometimes embroidered or edged with coloured thread, not purely for decoration but as a mark of care and respect for the occasion. The midwife's tools could include small knives or scissors for cutting the umbilical cord, and in some places, heated metal instruments for sealing it. These were kept covered until needed, partly to keep them clean and partly to avoid alarming the mother. Cleanliness, as understood in the period, meant free from visible dirt rather than sterile in the modern sense. Water was often brought into the room in advance for washing hands and tools, and in some cases it was infused with herbs thought to protect against infection. The chair itself was sometimes adjusted during labour. If the mother became too tired to remain upright, cushions could be added behind her back, or she might be moved to a lower stool or even to the bed. The rope or bar could be removed or repositioned to give her more comfort. These adjustments were part of the midwife's role, responding to the needs of the mother rather than following a rigid method. Some midwives carried their birthing chairs, ropes, and tools from one home to another. These travelling kits were a sign of their profession and their readiness to attend a birth at short notice. The equipment might be wrapped in cloth to protect it during transport, with herbs tucked inside to mask any odours. This portability allowed even remote households to receive skilled assistance, though the quality of the tools varied widely. In noble households, there might be several attendants working together, each responsible for part of the preparation. One might hold the rope in place, another manage the oils, while the midwife focused entirely on the delivery. The birthing chair could be placed on a special mat, sometimes woven with patterns believed to protect mother and child. In contrast, in rural homes, the scene was simpler, with perhaps only the midwife and a female relative present. I think there is a quiet dignity in the way these tools, no matter how basic, were treated with such seriousness and care. After the birth, the chair and tools were cleaned as best as possible and stored away until needed again. In some traditions, the chair was placed in the sun for several days to remove lingering odours and to purify it. Oils and fats were replenished, ropes checked for wear, and cloths laundered if they could be reused. If a birth had gone badly, there might be additional rituals to cleanse the items spiritually before they were used again. The design of these tools reflected a balance between the physical realities of childbirth and the beliefs that shaped medieval life. The birthing chair and support ropes made use of gravity and human strength in a practical way. The oils addressed a very real medical need, even if the understanding of anatomy was limited. At the same time, the arrangement of these items in the room, their decoration, and the rituals surrounding their use were deeply tied to ideas about luck, protection, and the influence of unseen forces. To the people of the time, these tools were not merely objects. They were part of a network of preparation, intention, and tradition. Each one had its place, its moment, and its meaning. When the midwife stepped into the birthing room and saw the chair ready, the rope secured, and the oils at hand, she knew that everything was in order for the work ahead. As the mother lowered herself into the chair, hands gripping the rope or beam, the centuries of tradition behind these tools became more than history. They became the framework for the final, difficult stage of bringing a child into the world. The quiet before the first cries was filled with the creak of wood, the smell of warmed oil, and the firm, steady presence of the midwife at her side. In that moment, every tool was in its place, and every hand knew what to do. Once the birthing chair, ropes, oils, and cloths were arranged, there came the matter of controlling who could be present during the birth. In many households, this was not a casual decision. The rules about entry into the birthing room were strict, and they were enforced not just by the midwife but by the family as a whole. This was a space set apart, closed to most of the household and entirely closed to the outside world. The exclusion of men was absolute. Fathers, brothers, uncles, and even male servants were expected to remain outside no matter their rank in the household. This was partly due to ideas about modesty, but it was also linked to deeper beliefs about the nature of childbirth. The process was seen as dangerous and unpredictable, and male presence was thought to interfere with the natural flow of events. Some even believed that men brought a certain kind of energy into the room that could disturb the labouring mother or anger the protective spirits. Within the closed circle, only women with experience of childbirth were permitted. These might be older female relatives, trusted friends, or skilled midwives. Their presence served both practical and symbolic purposes. Practically, they knew how to assist the mother, adjust her position, or hand tools to the midwife without being asked. Symbolically, their presence formed a barrier, a wall of familiarity and understanding that kept the mother calm. It is interesting how a simple rule of exclusion could create such a strong sense of shared purpose inside the room. The idea of barring strangers was just as important as excluding men. Anyone who was not part of the household or known to the midwife was turned away. Strangers were thought to carry misfortune, whether through ill will, ignorance, or simply the wrong kind of energy. In some communities, even neighbours who had known the family for years might be kept out if they had not been specifically invited. The belief was that birth required a balance of forces, and an unfamiliar presence could tip that balance in the wrong direction. The doorway became the line between two worlds. On one side, there was the contained, focused atmosphere of the birthing space. On the other hand, the restless waiting of the household and the occasional sound of footsteps or whispers in the corridor. Those outside might pace, pray, or simply wait in silence, while those inside concentrated on the work of bringing new life into the world. To enforce these boundaries, the midwife or a senior female relative often took on the role of gatekeeper. She would position herself near the door, ready to intercept anyone who approached. In some cases, charms or protective objects were hung across the entrance, both to keep unwanted visitors out and to signal to everyone that this was now a sacred and protected space. The exclusion of men was so firmly rooted that even emergencies did not always change the rule. If something went wrong, the first response was to call for another experienced woman, not a man, even if he was a physician. In places where male doctors were allowed, they often had to wait until the room had been partially cleared or the mother had been covered in a way that preserved her modesty. From a modern perspective, it might seem impractical to refuse help based on gender. Yet for the people of the time, the rule was about preserving the sanctity of the birth as much as ensuring the safety of the mother. The sense of privacy was not only about who entered, but also about what was seen and heard. Women inside the room were expected to keep what they witnessed to themselves. Descriptions of the labour, the appearance of the mother, or the handling of complications were rarely shared outside. This secrecy added to the mystery of childbirth for men and younger women who had not yet experienced it. For them, birth was something spoken of in hushed tones, with details left vague. In noble households, the exclusion could be even more intense. The birthing room might be located in a secluded part of the residence, with guards or trusted servants posted in the hall to keep the curious away. Messages about the progress of the birth were sent out sparingly, often through a single designated messenger. This not only protected the mother from distraction, but also controlled the flow of information in a setting where politics and family alliances could be as sensitive as the birth itself. In rural homes, the rules were enforced more by custom than by physical barriers. A man approaching the house during a birth might be met at the door and politely told to wait elsewhere. If he ignored the instruction, he risked the disapproval of the entire community. Reputation mattered, and breaking the birthing room rule could mark a man as disrespectful or foolish for years to come. The physical arrangement of the room reflected the exclusion as well. The door might be covered with a cloth to block the view from outside. Windows could be shuttered or their lower halves screened to prevent anyone from looking in. The women inside moved freely without concern for who might be watching, secure in the knowledge that the space belonged entirely to them for the duration of the labour. This all-female environment allowed for a different kind of communication. Instructions were given with minimal words, often replaced by gestures or shared looks. Tasks flowed smoothly because the women knew what needed to be done without discussion. For the mother, this meant less distraction and a sense that she was surrounded by people who understood every stage of what she was going through. I find it notable that this tradition created one of the few spaces in the period where women held complete control and authority. When the birth was over, the rule about outsiders remained in place until the mother and baby were ready to be presented to the rest of the household. The woman would clean the room, tidy away the tools, and ensure that both mother and child were settled before allowing anyone else inside. This gradual reopening of the space marked the transition from the protected, intimate work of labour to the public celebration of a new life. These rules about presence in the birthing room were part practical caution, part cultural belief, and part social structure. They shaped the way births were experienced, remembered, and retold. For the women inside, it was a time of shared labour and trust. For those outside, it was a moment of waiting and anticipation, held at a respectful distance. The quiet authority of the midwife, the solidarity of the female attendants, and the firm exclusion of anyone deemed unsuitable all combined to create a space unlike any other in the household. It was temporary yet absolute, a small world with its own rules and rhythms, lasting only as long as the birth required and dissolving as soon as the child was safely in its mother's arms. Once the boundaries of the birthing space were set and the presence of each person was determined, attention turned to the atmosphere inside. One of the most carefully considered aspects was sound. The sounds allowed, encouraged, or forbidden during labour varied widely from place to place, shaped by layers of belief, superstition, and habit. The moment was thought to be delicate, both physically and spiritually, and the noise within the room could either protect or endanger the process. In some communities, silence was considered essential. This was not simply a matter of keeping the room calm. The belief was that sudden or loud noises could frighten the baby as it entered the world, disturbing its first moments and even affecting its temperament. In such places, the women present moved quietly, spoke in low tones if they spoke at all, and refrained from unnecessary activity that might cause sound. Cloth was handled gently, tools were set down softly, and the midwife's instructions were given with minimal words. The air felt heavy with expectation, broken only by the mother's breathing and the faint creak of the birthing chair. The silence could be so complete that even those outside the room would lower their voices or stop certain activities. Neighbours might postpone chores involving hammering or chopping wood, and children were kept from running past the house. The effort to maintain this stillness showed how deeply the idea of protecting the newborn's first impressions was embedded in the community's values. It is striking to think that something as natural as speaking could be seen as dangerous in such a moment. In other regions, the approach was entirely different. Rather than avoiding noise, families and midwives encouraged loud, rhythmic sounds during labour. These might include drumming, clapping, or even singing in strong voices. The purpose was to drive away harmful spirits or ill fortune that might linger near the birthing space. This was not random noise, but deliberate patterned sound believed to create a protective barrier around the mother and child. In these births, the room could be alive with the beat of a drum, the stamping of feet, or the sharp sound of clappers made from wood or bone. The choice of which approach to follow was often rooted in local history and passed down without question. A family that had always observed silence would see noise as reckless. A family accustomed to loud ritual would consider silence a dangerous neglect of duty. From a modern point of view, these customs might seem like opposites, but in their own context, each was simply another form of protection. Religious chanting was another common sound in certain areas. In such births, the low murmur or steady recitation of prayers filled the room from start to finish. This was done not only for the sake of the mother's comfort, but as a spiritual safeguard for the child. The chanting could come from a single person, often the eldest woman present, or from several women in turns, keeping the sound continuous while others tended to the work. The tone was steady and unbroken, creating a rhythm that matched the slow progress of the labour. The nature of the sound could also shift with the stage of the birth. In some traditions, the beginning of labour was accompanied by quiet or gentle sounds, which became louder and more energetic as the moment of delivery approached. In others, the sound would start strong to clear the space of negative forces and then soften to welcome the child into a calm environment. The rules were rarely written down, but were known by heart to those who had attended many births. For the mother, the chosen sound pattern could influence her experience deeply. Silence could heighten her awareness of each movement and sensation, making the labour feel more inward-focused. Loud ritual could give her a sense of being supported and defended by those around her. The rhythm of drumming or chanting might help her keep her breathing steady or distract her from discomfort. I find it fascinating how the same act of giving birth could be shaped so differently by something as simple as sound. Outside the room, sound carried meaning as well. A silent room might signal that all was proceeding normally according to tradition, or it could cause anxiety if the custom was to make noise. Conversely, a noisy room could reassure those outside in some communities, or cause unease in others. The sound, or lack of it, was a message to the waiting household, even if it was not meant as one. There were also beliefs about certain sounds to avoid at all costs. Whistling was sometimes thought to invite unwanted spirits. Metal clanging could be linked to misfortune. Even laughter, though not forbidden everywhere, was viewed with suspicion in certain places, as if joy in the wrong moment might draw envy from the unseen. These prohibitions were often specific to a single village or family line, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. The tools used to make sound during a birth could be treasured objects, kept only for that purpose. A particular drum might belong to the midwife and be used in every birth she attends. Wooden clappers could be passed down through several generations, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. These items held both practical and symbolic value, representing the accumulated knowledge and care of those who had brought countless children into the world. In noble households, the use of sound was sometimes more ceremonial. Musicians or chanters might be stationed just outside the birthing chamber, their work audible but physically separate from the mother. This allowed for the maintenance of tradition while preserving the intimacy of the room. The music or chanting could continue for hours, shifting subtly in pace and tone as the labour progressed. In rural homes, the resources for sound making were simpler but no less meaningful. A hand drum, a pot struck with a wooden spoon, or even rhythmic clapping could serve the same purpose as more elaborate instruments. The focus was always on the effect, not the refinement of the sound. The intention mattered more than the artistry. Once the baby was born, the handling of sound changed. In a silence-keeping tradition, voices might rise in relief and joy, with the first cries of the child welcomed into a warmer atmosphere. In a noise-making tradition, the sounds might grow even louder for a short time to celebrate and seal the child's safe arrival. Afterward, the room would settle, and the sounds would fade into the ordinary noises of daily life. Whether the birth had taken place in complete silence, with steady chanting, or amid the beat of a drum, the memory of that sound would linger for everyone present. For the mother, it would be tied to the sensations of labour and the first sight of her child. For the attendants, it would be another link in the chain of births they had witnessed, each with its unique combination of people, tools, and sounds. Once the decisions about sound were made and the atmosphere of the birthing room was set, another matter often stirred quiet disagreement among the women present: how, if at all, to reduce the pain of labour. Pain was accepted as a natural part of childbirth, but in some places it was seen as something to be endured without interference. In others, certain methods were used to dull or distract from it. The choice of whether to allow these methods was shaped by tradition, belief, and the resources available in the household. One of the most common approaches was the use of strong drink. A cup of undiluted wine, or in some cases a stronger spirit, would be given to the mother shortly before or during the early stages of labour. The warmth of the alcohol, along with its numbing effect, could relax her muscles and blunt the sharpness of the contractions. This was not done carelessly. The amount was often small enough to take the edge off, but not enough to cause confusion or make her unsteady. The midwife or an older woman would control the cup, offering it only at certain moments. For families accustomed to the use of wine in daily life, this was seen as a reasonable and familiar aid. Yet even this simple measure was not without controversy. In more pious or conservative households, giving alcohol to a labouring woman was frowned upon, either because it was seen as indulgent or because of fears it might harm the baby. Some believed it dulled the mother's awareness too much, weakening her ability to push effectively. Others argued that any interference with the natural sensations of birth was against divine will. It is almost amusing to realise how something as ordinary as a drink could be a source of whispered judgment at such a time. Another method found in certain regions was the inhalation of herbal smoke. This might come from burning plants known for their calming or mildly sedative qualities. The herbs were placed in a small brazier or clay pot, and the smoke allowed to drift toward the mother's face. She would breathe it in slowly, sometimes through a cloth held over her mouth and nose. The effect was gentle rather than overwhelming, intended to loosen tension rather than render her unaware. Common choices included dried lavender, sage, or specific local plants known for soothing the nerves. The use of such smoke was often tied to ritual. Lighting the herbs might be accompanied by quiet chanting or the recitation of protective verses. The scent and warmth of the smoke became part of the atmosphere of the birth, and for women who had grown up with it, the process could be reassuring as well as physically helpful. But here too, there were objections. Some women disliked the heaviness of the smoke in the air. Others feared that the scent could linger too strongly on the newborn's skin or blanket. In rare cases, the burning of certain herbs was linked to beliefs about attracting unwanted spiritual attention. A simpler, more practical form of pain relief was the use of ice or cold stones. This was far less common, since ice was not easily obtained in most places and seasons, in households that could store it, perhaps by keeping it in deep cellars or bringing it from mountain regions. Small pieces would be wrapped in cloth and placed in the mother's mouth. The cold was thought to distract from the pain, giving her something to focus on during contractions. It also helped keep her from becoming overheated in the close, crowded room. This method carried no ritual meaning, relying only on the physical sensation to shift her attention. The rarity of ice made it something of a luxury, and in some communities it was viewed as an extravagant or unnecessary measure. Still, for those who had access to it, the relief it provided was valued. From a modern perspective, the image of a woman in a dimly lit birthing room quietly sucking on a piece of ice while others fanned her is unexpectedly vivid. It shows how even small comforts could take on importance in such a setting. The debate over whether to use these methods often played out quietly before the birth, sometimes in conversations between the midwife and the family's elder women. If the household had a tradition of using wine, smoke, or cold, the expectation was that it would be offered. If not, Introducing it might require careful explanation and persuasion. In many cases, the mother herself had little say in the decision, especially if it went against the usual practice of her family. Practical considerations also played a role. Wine or spirits needed to be available and of sufficient quality. The herbs for smoking had to be gathered and dried ahead of time, stored safely so they would burn cleanly. Ice or cold stones required advanced planning and storage. These preparations were another layer of work for the women responsible for the birth, adding to the tasks of readying the room, laying out linens, and preparing the birthing chair. The actual administration of these aids was handled with care. The midwife, or a trusted helper, would decide the moment to offer wine or light the herbs. Too early, and the effect might fade before the most difficult stage of labour. Too late, and the mother might already be too distracted by the pain to benefit fully. Timing was a skill built on experience, learned from many births and adjusted for the needs of each woman. Once a chosen method was used, it became part of the birth's memory. A woman who had been given wine during her first labour might expect it for the second. If she'd found comfort in the scent of burning herbs, she might ask for them again, though such requests were often made through hints rather than direct statements. In households where ice was available, its absence in a later birth could feel like a small loss, even if it had made only a minor difference to the pain. These methods, whether accepted or resisted, reflected the same underlying aim to guide the mother safely through the ordeal of labour with as much strength and calm as possible. The fact that they could cause disagreement only shows how personal and varied the traditions of childbirth could be. I think it is telling that even in moments of such shared purpose, people still found ways to differ over the smallest details. As with many customs surrounding childbirth, the choice of pain relief method was not simply about comfort. It was bound up with ideas about morality, health, and the unseen forces believed to influence life and death. In one place, giving wine might be seen as an act of kindness. In another, it might be taken as a sign of weakness or even a risk to the child's soul. The burning of herbs could be praised for its protective power or dismissed as unnecessary superstition. In the end, whether the mother faced her labour with only her breath and will, or with the warmth of wine, the scent of herbs, or the chill of ice, the birth would proceed as births always had, carried forward by the steady work of the women around her. What remained afterward was the memory of that long, narrow space between pain and relief, filled with the small choices that marked one birth from another. In many households, the work of labour did not end when the child emerged. The moment of birth was followed by a swift shift in attention from the mother's endurance to the child's survival. In regions where religious belief held a strong influence, the safety of the newborn soul was considered urgent. If the baby appeared weak, slow to breathe, or pale, there was little time to wait for formalities. A temporary baptism, performed on the spot, was seen as the surest way to protect the child's spiritual fate. This belief shaped the way the birthing room was prepared. Alongside cloths for drying the baby, swaddling wraps, and warm water for cleaning, there was always a small vessel of holy water within reach. It might be a simple clay jar with a lid, or a more decorated container of metal or glass, depending on the family's means. It was not kept for decoration. Its presence was a deliberate precaution, a quiet acknowledgement that not every child would greet the world with a strong cry. The duty of performing this emergency baptism often fell to the midwife. She was trusted not only for her knowledge of childbirth, but also for her understanding of the ritual's steps. The action was straightforward, a few drops of holy water placed on the infant's forehead, sometimes accompanied by a brief invocation or sign of blessing. It was done quickly, without ceremony, so as not to delay any efforts to stimulate the baby's breathing. For those present, seeing the water touch the child was a moment of both hope and relief. Families believed that this immediate act could mean the difference between eternal peace and loss. If the child recovered, the baptism might later be repeated formally in the presence of a priest, but this initial ritual was still considered valid. It is almost ironic that a few drops of water, so small in themselves, could carry such immense weight in the minds of those watching. The readiness for baptism shaped the arrangement of the room. The holy water was usually kept near the head of the birthing bed, where the midwife could reach it without stepping away from the mother. In wealthier homes, a small table might be set aside for sacred items, the water vessel, a cloth for wiping the child's head afterward, and perhaps a small cross. In humbler settings, the water might rest on the floor beside the bed, covered to keep it clean. The decision to baptize immediately was not taken lightly. In some families, it was reserved only for those situations where the baby showed clear signs of distress. In others, the act was performed as a precaution even for healthy newborns, the reasoning being that one could never be too certain of survival in those first fragile hours. The choice often reflected the customs of the community and the personal convictions of the household's elders. There were debates, though they were rarely voiced openly in the tense moments after birth. Some argued that such an important sacrament should always be administered by a priest, not a layperson, even in emergencies. Others insisted that the urgency of the newborn's condition justified immediate action. In most cases, necessity outweighed hesitation. The midwife's word carried weight, and if she judged the baptism to be needed, few would object. The practice was not purely religious in its effect. It also served as a signal to everyone present that the child's condition was serious, prompting greater focus and care. Once the water was applied, the midwife or assistants might redouble their efforts to warm the baby, stimulate breathing, or wrap it more securely. The ritual became both a spiritual safeguard and a rallying call to save the child's life. The presence of holy water in the birthing room was often the responsibility of the household's women. Well before the expected date, someone would fetch it from the church or shrine. It might be replaced regularly if the waiting period stretched on, ensuring it was always fresh and sanctified. The container would be handled with care, kept covered when not in use, and never repurposed for anything else. From a modern point of view, the idea of keeping a sacred vessel beside a bed for weeks on end may seem excessive, but in that time, it was simply part of being prepared. In certain regions, there were added elements to this emergency baptism. A sprig of a blessed plant might be dipped into the water and used to sprinkle the child. A small piece of white cloth could be placed over the baby's head afterward, symbolizing purity. In very traditional households, a whispered blessing from the eldest woman present would follow, sealing the act with the authority of age and experience. If the child survived and regained strength, the family would later arrange for a formal baptism at the church, often within days. The priest would be told of the earlier emergency rite, and in some traditions, this would be incorporated into the formal ceremony with specific prayers of thanksgiving. In cases where the child did not survive, the knowledge that the baptism had been performed brought consolation to the family, easing the grief with the belief that the soul had been secured. This urgency also influenced the training of midwives. Women who took on the role were taught not only about birth, but also about the correct way to administer the sacrament in a moment of need. The responsibility was heavy, and many midwives carried a quiet pride in being trusted with such a task. They understood that their work was not limited to the body, it extended to the soul. While the practice was rooted in religious conviction, it also reflected a broader truth about childbirth in the past life, and death often stood close together in those first moments. The room where a baby took its first breath could also be the place where its fate was decided. The baptism, brief and simple, was one way families sought to tilt that balance toward hope. In some communities, stories of miraculous recoveries after an emergency baptism were told and retold, reinforcing the belief in its power, whether these were seen as divine intervention or simply the result of quick action. They added to the ritual's standing. Women who had witnessed such moments spoke of them with quiet conviction, ensuring that the practice would continue in future generations. The tradition, while consistent in purpose, varied in its details from place to place. Some families preferred the water to be poured directly onto the baby's forehead. Others favoured a gentle touch with fingers moistened in the vessel. The essential element was the contact, the physical joining of the child in the blessed water. As with many customs surrounding birth, the ritual of immediate baptism was both practical and symbolic. It addressed the visible reality of a fragile newborn, while also speaking to the invisible concerns of faith. In the quiet of the birthing room, among the low voices and the rustle of cloth, it was a moment of stillness and focus. Those present would remember it, whether the outcome was joy or sorrow. I find it striking how such a brief action could carry the weight of both relief and fear at the same time. The scene would soon shift to the next stage, as the baby was dried, wrapped, and placed near the mother. But the memory of the holy water's touch would linger, a reminder that even in the most private and physical of moments, the unseen world was never far away. Among the many situations that could arise during childbirth, the arrival of twins was one of the most striking. It was not an everyday event, and when it happened, it drew immediate attention from everyone in the household and the wider community. The reactions to it could range from wonder to suspicion, depending on the beliefs of the time and the character of the people involved. In many medieval communities, twins were not simply seen as a biological coincidence. They were a sign to be interpreted, a message that required explanation. For some, the birth of twins was a blessing touched by the supernatural. People might say that the gods or saints had intervened, granting the family a double gift. In places where fertility was highly valued, this could be taken as a mark of divine favour. The mother would be surrounded with praise, and the family might hold a small feast in honour of the event. Yet even in these situations, the extraordinary nature of twin births was treated with a hint of caution. Blessings could turn to curses if not properly managed, so protective measures were often taken from the very beginning. In other regions, the same event could be met with suspicion. The idea that a woman might give birth to 2 children from the same pregnancy did not always fit neatly into the medical understanding of the time. In some villages, rumours might circulate that the mother had been unfaithful and that the twins were the offspring of 2 different fathers. This suspicion could cause tension within the household, especially if the children looked noticeably different from each other. It is almost amusing to think that instead of celebrating the rare and remarkable, some chose to turn it into a reason for gossip. To ward off any potential harm, charms and protective items were often prepared for twins immediately after birth. These could be small amulets worn on a string, sprigs of certain herbs hung near the cradle, or patterns drawn on the walls of the room. In some traditions, the midwife would place a small piece of iron under the bedding, believing that it would repel evil forces. Twins were seen as more vulnerable to spiritual attack, and so their early days were spent under constant watch. Special prayers or blessings might be performed over them before they even leave the birthing room. In Christian communities, this could mean arranging for an immediate baptism, sometimes in the same manner as was done for weak or sickly infants. The urgency reflected a belief that twins, while fortunate in some ways, might also attract the envy or malice of unseen powers. The family sought to close every possible opening for misfortune to slip in. The way twins were handled in the first days could also reflect deeper cultural attitudes toward childbirth. In some places, the mother was kept in a more extended period of seclusion, both for her recovery and to shield the babies from too much public attention. Visitors were carefully chosen, and strangers were kept away entirely. The risk of carrying bad luck into the room was considered too great to take lightly. Today, the arrival of twins might make headlines on social media, complete with photographs and cheerful announcements, but in those days, it could remain a guarded secret for weeks. There were also practical considerations. Caring for 1 newborn was demanding enough. Caring for 2 doubled the effort. In wealthier households, this might mean assigning extra servants or wet nurses to assist the mother. In poorer homes, it could strain the family's resources. Extra mouths to feed, more clothing to make, and more attention to give could create difficulties that lasted long after the initial excitement faded. the feeding of twins brought its own challenges. If the mother could not produce enough milk, the family had to find alternatives quickly. Wet nurses might be brought in, sometimes one for each child. In rural areas without access to such help, animal milk could be used, though this carries health risks. Feeding schedules had to be carefully managed, and sleepless nights became an inevitable part of the household routine. Twins also had symbolic roles in certain cultures. Some associated them with cosmic balance, seeing them as representatives of light and dark, day and night, or other paired forces. In other places, they were linked to folk tales or legends that shaped how the community interacted with them. These stories could influence the kinds of gifts they received, or the rituals performed on their behalf. Not all attention was positive. In times of hardship, twins could be seen as a burden rather than a blessing. If food was scarce or disease was present, some whispered that 2 children at once might be too much for fate to allow. Such thoughts were rarely voiced openly, but they could be felt in the way people avoided speaking of the twins' future. I often think about how much of a mother's joy in those moments depended on whether the people around her chose to celebrate or to judge. Physical differences between twins could fuel speculation. If one child appeared stronger or larger, people might say that they were destined for leadership, while the smaller one was marked for a quieter life. If they looked alike, there could be talk of them sharing an unbreakable bond. These ideas could follow them throughout their lives, shaping expectations in ways they could not control. The mother herself might carry mixed feelings. On one hand, she could take pride in having brought 2 new lives into the world at once. On the other hand, she might fear the added responsibility and the scrutiny that came with it. Her recovery could be harder, and her time in seclusion might be longer. Family members might try to shield her from criticism, but whispers often found their way through closed doors. Once the mother and twins were ready to be seen in public, there might be a small presentation to the community. In villages where such occasions were important, the appearance of twins could draw a crowd. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine goodwill. Offerings of food, cloth, or small charms could be made, each carrying its own message of support or protection. Over time, as the twins grew, their birth story would become a part of family history. It might be told with pride, with humour, or with a hint of unease, depending on the original circumstances. The event was rarely forgotten, even decades later. In this way, the birth of twins left a lasting imprint, not only on the family but also on the community's shared memory. The reactions to twin births in the medieval period reveal how tightly woven belief, superstition, and practical reality were. They show that childbirth was never simply a private matter, but a moment when personal life and public perception collided. How that moment was handled could shape not only the early days of the twins' lives, but also the way they were seen for years to come. As the mother's confinement continued, the focus would gradually shift away from the extraordinary nature of the birth and back to the everyday challenges of caring for her children. And yet, the memory of that double arrival would remain, a reminder that even in the most familiar events, the unexpected could appear without warning. After the long hours of childbirth, the woman was not treated as someone who had simply completed a difficult task. In many communities, she was seen as someone in a temporary state of impurity. The rules that followed were strict and could affect every part of her daily life. She was often not allowed to step outside her home for the first 40 days after giving birth. This was not just to protect her health. It was believed that the act of childbirth left her spiritually vulnerable and more open to harmful forces. These beliefs could vary from place to place, but the sense of caution was almost always present. Her movements inside the house were also limited. She might be asked to stay in certain rooms, avoiding spaces where food was prepared or stored. This restriction was not simply about hygiene in the way we understand it today. Instead, people feared that her presence could bring bad luck or illness to the food that others would eat. It is almost amusing how they treated a new mother as if she were carrying an invisible cloud of danger around her. Religious rules added another layer to her isolation. She could not attend church services or take part in any communal prayers until a purification ritual was performed. This ritual, often called churching, was meant to cleanse her after childbirth. It was a formal acknowledgement that she could return to normal life in the eyes of the community and the church. Until then, she was absent from events that might be important to her family. It was a long period of waiting that could feel both lonely and restrictive. The physical recovery period was mixed with these cultural rules. In theory, rest could help her heal from the strain of childbirth. In practice, the confinement sometimes meant she had little access to fresh air or sunlight. The inside of a medieval home could be dark and smoky, especially in winter. Without a modern understanding of nutrition and infection, these conditions were not always beneficial for her health. In our time, a mother might be encouraged to walk around the hospital ward within hours, which shows how dramatically attitudes toward postpartum recovery have shifted. Family members had different reactions to these customs. Some saw them as necessary traditions that must be followed for the safety of both mother and child. Others may have quietly questioned their value but went along with them to avoid conflict. A mother-in-law could be the strict enforcer of these rules, ensuring that the new mother stayed within the expected boundaries. This dynamic sometimes caused tension, as the woman recovering from childbirth also had to manage family relationships. Her contact with the outside world came mainly through the people who visited her. Female relatives, friends, or neighbours might bring food, help with chores, or offer advice about caring for the newborn. These visits could be a source of comfort but also of gossip. News travelled quickly in small communities, and the postpartum period was no exception. What the new mother ate, how she held the baby, or even how she looked could become topics of conversation. Food restrictions were another part of this phase. She might be given certain broths, porridges, or herbal drinks considered good for recovery. At the same time, she was told to avoid other foods, sometimes without any medical reason. The reasoning could be based on old beliefs about hot and cold foods or on fears about what might affect the quality of her milk. I have always found it striking how rules that claim to protect could also limit and control at the same time. These customs did not end all at once. The 40-day mark was important, but even after the purification ritual, some women continued to observe smaller restrictions for weeks or months. They might avoid certain tasks, travel less, or maintain a cautious approach to public gatherings. In some regions, there were small celebrations when the confinement ended. Family and friends would come together to mark the mother's return to public life, often with a shared meal or a gift for the child. The child's health was also closely linked to these customs. People believed that protecting the mother from certain sights, smells, or events would indirectly protect the infant. For example, the mother might be told to avoid funerals or sick people during this period. The idea was that any exposure to death or illness could bring harm to the child through her. Such beliefs reinforced the importance of keeping her away from anything considered unlucky. From a modern perspective, these customs can look like a mix of practical and superstitious rules. On one hand, encouraging a mother to rest after childbirth makes sense. On the other hand, isolating her from social and religious life based on ideas about impurity feels unnecessarily harsh. The combination of care and control reveals how societies tried to manage the unpredictable nature of childbirth with both compassion and fear. Clothing during this period was simple and often looser than usual. The mother might wear garments that were easy to wash and comfortable for nursing. She would also be wrapped in extra layers if the weather was cold, as it was believed that cold air could cause illness in her weakened state. Bedding was adjusted to keep her warm and to allow her to rest without disturbance. The newborn was kept close to her almost at all times. This served practical needs for feeding and warmth, but also followed the belief that mother and child should not be separated in the early days. Visitors might be allowed to see the baby, but were not permitted to hold it without certain precautions, such as washing hands or saying a blessing. These rules varied by region, but the underlying intention was to protect the child from harm. As the days passed, the mother's role in household life slowly began to return. She might start helping with light chores, though heavy work was still avoided. The balance between recovery and responsibility was delicate. Too much activity too soon could be criticised as reckless, but too little could be seen as laziness. These judgments reflected the constant social scrutiny that women faced. When the time finally came for the purification ritual, it was both a relief and a public statement. The walk to the church might be her first time outside in over a month. People noticed her appearance and demeanour, assessing how she had weathered the postpartum period. The ceremony was usually brief but carried significant symbolic weight. It marked her reintegration into the community, her return to religious life, and her readiness to take on her duties without restriction. In this way, the weeks after childbirth were as much about navigating social expectations as they were about physical recovery. The customs shaped how a woman experienced the transition to motherhood, defining not only what she could do, but also how she was seen. And in the quiet after the ritual, when the visits became less frequent and daily life resumed its pace, she stepped into her new role fully, carrying the weight of both her family's hopes and the traditions that surrounded her. The next stage in her journey after childbirth would bring its challenges, shaped by the needs of the child and the expectations of the household. In the days following childbirth, the mother's diet became a central concern for both her recovery and the health of her newborn. Food was not just about satisfying hunger. It was part of a carefully structured plan shaped by generations of belief, observation, and superstition. Every ingredient placed in front of her was chosen with purpose, whether for its warming qualities, its supposed ability to cleanse the body, or its symbolic meaning in ensuring a healthy future for the child. One of the most common dishes served in this period was bone broth. The bones, often from poultry or pork, were simmered for long hours until the liquid turned rich and slightly cloudy. The resulting soup was thought to be nourishing for the blood, replenishing what had been lost during childbirth. Into this broth, cooks might add slices of red meat, which symbolized vitality and strength. This was not a time for light or cold foods. Warmth, in every sense, was considered essential for recovery. It is almost funny how they treated the dining table like a second medicine chest, with every spoonful expected to heal. Herbs also played a major role. Certain bitter herbs were prepared as infusions or mixed into meals, their taste strong enough to make the new mother wince. These were believed to push out bad air or expel any lingering impurities from the body. The bitterness itself was sometimes seen as proof of their effectiveness. Family members might insist on these herbal brews even if the mother found them unpleasant, trusting in tradition over comfort. A milder indulgence was a small amount of wine, often diluted and sweetened with honey. This was thought to restore energy and improve circulation. While wine had religious and ceremonial uses, here it was simply another tool in the recovery process. The sweetness of the honey balanced the wine's sharpness and symbolized good fortune. Today, most new mothers are handed a glass of water and perhaps a snack from the hospital cafeteria, which shows how far medical care has shifted from symbolic to strictly practical. The serving of these foods followed certain rhythms. Meals were brought at regular times, not left to the mother's choice. She was encouraged to eat even if her appetite was small, as it was believed that refusing food could slow recovery or weaken her milk supply. In some households, special trays and bowls were used only for postpartum meals, marking the importance of this phase in her life. Some dishes carried meanings beyond physical nourishment. A soup with eggs could symbolize fertility and the hope for more children. A porridge made with specific grains might be linked to good fortune or stability in the household. Even the way the food was arranged could carry significance. Red-coloured foods, for instance, were considered lucky and could appear more often during this period. Not all of these customs were universal. In some regions, fish was avoided entirely during the postpartum phase, seen as too cooling for the body. In others, certain fruits were forbidden for fear they might cause stomach troubles or affect milk production. These rules could be strict, and breaking them might invite criticism from elders. The mother, still in a fragile state, often followed them without question, whether she believed in their power or not. The preparation of these meals was usually handled by women in the family or by a hired cook experienced in postpartum care. These cooks knew not only the recipes, but also the small details that were believed to make the food more effective. The broth had to be simmered at a steady heat, the herbs had to be added at just the right moment, and the wine had to be warmed but never boiled. These steps were treated almost like sacred instructions. Alongside the nourishing dishes, there were drinks meant specifically for recovery. Herbal teas were common, sometimes with ingredients like ginger for warmth or fennel for digestion. Some households prepared a sweet rice drink flavoured with spices, offering comfort and gentle energy. These beverages were as much about maintaining tradition as they were about providing sustenance. Eating during this time was rarely a solitary act. The mother was often surrounded by women who encouraged her, adjusted her pillows, or made sure her food stayed warm. This was both care and surveillance. Her intake was noted and discussed, with relatives ready to advise if they felt she was eating too little or too much. I cannot help but think that this constant attention, while well meant, could easily feel overwhelming. The rules of postpartum diet could extend well beyond the first weeks. Some women were told to continue eating certain foods for months, especially if they were breastfeeding. They might avoid foods considered windy or hard to digest, even if there was no real evidence for these claims. In such cases, tradition outweighed personal preference, and compliance became a sign of respect for family customs. In wealthier households, the postpartum diet could be elaborate, with rare ingredients and complex dishes prepared daily. In poorer homes, the focus might simply be on making broth from whatever bones were available and finding herbs that could be gathered nearby. Despite these differences, the underlying idea was the same: food was central to healing. The act of feeding the mother was also a way for the family to demonstrate care and status. Visitors might bring gifts of food, such as preserved meats, fine wines, or dried fruits, as tokens of goodwill. These gifts were displayed before being served, a quiet show of the family's connections and generosity. The mother's recovery was not only a personal matter, but also a reflection of the household's standing in the community. In some places, the end of the postpartum period was marked by a meal shared with friends and relatives. This meal would include dishes the mother had avoided during her recovery, symbolizing her return to normal life. It was both a celebration and a public signal that she was ready to resume her place in the household and society. Through all of these customs, the postpartum diet reflected the blend of practicality and belief that shaped medieval life. Warm, nourishing foods likely did help recovery, while certain restrictions may have had little real effect, yet every rule, every ingredient, carried a history of being passed down through generations. It was a reminder that childbirth was not just a private event, but part of a much larger cultural story. Even today, echoes of these practices can be found in certain cultures. Some families still prepare bone broth for new mothers or follow traditional food taboos. Others have replaced these with modern nutritional advice, focusing on balanced meals and hydration. The details may have changed, but the idea that food plays a central role in healing after birth remains. The weeks after childbirth were a delicate balance between physical recovery, family expectations, and cultural tradition. What the mother ate was one of the few things she could control, yet even that was shaped by the hands of others. In those quiet meals, served in the dim light of her confinement room, she took in more than nourishment. She absorbed the weight of her family's hopes, the comfort of shared rituals, and the unbroken thread of practices that stretched back centuries. The next part of her journey would move from the intimate space of recovery meals to the more visible responsibilities that awaited her in the household. Among the customs surrounding childbirth in the medieval world, one of the most enduring was the protection of newborns through the use of unusual objects. These were not random trinkets chosen at whim, but carefully selected items believed to carry specific powers. The people of the time lived in a world where illness, sudden death, and misfortune were all too common. For them, a newborn represented both hope and fragility, a life that needed guarding from forces both seen and unseen. Protective measures began as soon as the child entered the world, sometimes even before the mother had fully recovered. A small knife was one of the most common items placed near a baby. Often, it would be slid under the pillow or tucked beneath the mattress of the cradle. The idea was not that the knife would be used in any physical defense, but that its cold iron blade could repel harmful spirits or break curses. Iron was widely believed to have protective qualities, a material that could stand firm against the invisible. The size of the knife varied. In poorer homes, it might be no more than a simple utility blade, while wealthier families might use an ornamental dagger with an engraved handle. It is almost amusing to think that in a time when real dangers like hunger and disease loomed so large, people feared invisible forces more than the tangible ones. Another widespread practice was sprinkling ash around the baby's sleeping area. This could be ash from a household hearth, or specially burned herbs, chosen for their supposed spiritual properties. The ash was spread in a circle or a loose ring, forming a barrier that spirits or witches were believed to be unable to cross. The smell and texture of ash also had a symbolic weight, representing purity in some traditions and destruction of evil in others. Families might renew the ash daily, sweeping it away each morning and laying down a fresh layer in the evening. Animal parts, particularly teeth or claws, were also used in protective charms. A necklace made from small animal teeth, for example, was believed to transfer the strength or cunning of the animal to the child. In rural areas, these teeth often came from wolves, dogs, or boars, while in coastal regions, they might come from fish or marine mammals. The necklace would be tied loosely around the baby's neck or wrist, sometimes wrapped in cloth to keep it from scratching the skin. These amulets were often kept until the child was older, sometimes passed on to sibling, or preserved as a keepsake. Today, parents might opt for soft toys or musical mobiles, yet the intention is not so different from those medieval charms. The placement of these objects was often guided by tradition. A knife under the pillow was usually positioned so that the blade pointed toward the door, symbolizing a ward against anything approaching. The ash circle was carefully maintained without gaps, as even the smallest opening was thought to allow evil entry. Necklaces or amulets were often blessed by a local priest, even if the objects themselves came from non-Christian traditions. This blending of folk belief and religious practice was common in many parts of the medieval world. Some protective measures went beyond the cradle. Families might hang certain plants above the doorway to the room where the baby slept. Rue, garlic, and juniper were popular choices, each carrying a reputation for keeping harmful entities away. Visitors to the home might be required to touch the iron or make the sign of the cross before approaching the infant. These customs were as much about community participation as they were about the objects themselves. Everyone had a role in keeping the newborn safe. The choice of protective items could also reflect the family's social standing. A wealthy household might have charms made of silver or gold, crafted by skilled artisans, while a poorer one would rely on what was readily available in nature or the marketplace. Yet the belief in their power cut across class lines. Whether the charm was a polished jewel or a rough wolf's tooth, it was given the same symbolic weight. The use of such objects was not without criticism. Religious leaders sometimes warned against placing too much faith in charms, urging families to trust in prayer and sacraments instead. Still, these warnings rarely had the desired effect. People held to the customs of their ancestors, reasoning that it was better to be safe than sorry. The church itself occasionally adapted, allowing certain objects to be blessed so that they could coexist with religious protections. The symbolism attached to these objects could deepen over time. A knife that had once lain under a baby's pillow might later be kept as a personal talisman by that same child in adulthood. An ash circle, once just a household practice, could be remembered as part of a family's identity. Animal tooth necklaces might be stored with other family heirlooms, reminders of a time when survival was fragile and every measure, no matter how strange, was worth taking. These customs also reveal how closely daily life and spiritual belief were intertwined. Protection was not only about warding off harm, it was a way of acknowledging the child's place in the world. By surrounding them with symbols of strength, the family affirmed their hopes for the baby's future. In a world without modern medicine, such acts carried deep emotional importance. I find it striking how these small, quiet rituals could hold as much weight for a family as any grand ceremony. The persistence of these practices across centuries shows how resilient human habits can be when they offer comfort, even when people migrated or adapted to new religions. Many of these protective customs survived in some form. Some evolved, others blended with newer traditions, but their core purpose remained. A baby's vulnerability was universally recognized, and the instinct to guard that life was just as universal. While many of these objects might seem quaint or superstitious now, they were part of a larger system of care. Alongside feeding, cleaning, and keeping the baby warm, guarding them from unseen harm was seen as essential. The presence of a knife, a ring of ash, or a tooth necklace was not considered optional. It was as much a part of the nursery as the bedding or the cradle itself. In looking at these customs, we also catch a glimpse of the emotional landscape of the medieval household. Every parent knew the risks their child faced in those early days. Placing a charm by the crib was a small act, but one that carried immense emotional weight. It was a way of saying, silently, that nothing would be left to chance. And so, in the dim light of a medieval home, a newborn might sleep soundly under the watchful guard of metal, ash, and bone. Outside, the world was uncertain, but within that small circle of protection, the family believed their child was safe. The next custom in this long chain of traditions would take that same instinct for protection and shape it into a different kind of ritual altogether, one that reached beyond the physical and into the realm of spiritual safeguarding. Among the more curious and sometimes unsettling customs of caring for newborns in the medieval period was the practice of binding and shaping their bodies. This was not about medical necessity, though some might have claimed it was for the child's health. Instead, it reflected the period's deeply held ideas about beauty, symmetry, and proper form. From the first days of life, some infants were swaddled so tightly that they could barely move their arms or legs. The reasoning was that a straight, firm posture would help them grow into what was considered a well-proportioned adult. Swaddling was common across many cultures of the time, but in certain regions, the tightness was taken to an extreme. Layers of cloth were wrapped around the infant's limbs and torso, with each layer pulled snug before the next was added. The baby's arms were often pinned flat against their sides, their legs held straight together. This was believed to prevent crooked limbs, a hunched back, or other perceived imperfections. Mothers and midwives took pride in their skill at wrapping a child so neatly and evenly. The result was a small as rigid bundle that could be easily carried or placed in a cradle without much risk of the child shifting. It is almost comical to think that babies, known for their constant wiggling, were once prized for lying completely still. In some communities, the shaping went beyond limbs. The head itself became a focus of modification. By binding the skull with cloth bands, it was possible to alter the shape as the bones grew and fused. This might be done to create a more elongated head, a higher crown, or a particular slope to the forehead. The exact style depended on regional ideals of beauty or status. The process began within weeks of birth, when the skull bones were still soft and pliable. Strips of fabric were wrapped around the head in a precise pattern, and the binding was adjusted regularly as the child grew. This could continue for months or even years, depending on the desired result. The origins of cranial binding varied. In some places, it was linked to nobility, marking the child as belonging to a high-status family. In others, it was simply an aesthetic preference passed down through generations. Regardless of the reason, it was a deliberate intervention into the child's natural development. The practice was so normalized in certain areas that an unshaped head could be seen as a sign of neglect. Today, Shaping a baby's skull might involve specialized medical helmets for rare conditions, yet the intent to alter appearance remains oddly familiar. Keeping a child still for long periods was considered both a necessity for shaping and a way to ensure safety. Infants were often placed on a flat board or in a narrow cradle, sometimes with straps to prevent them from rolling over. Movement was seen as a risk, both for disrupting the shaping process and for causing injury. A baby might spend many hours in this restrained position, taken out only for feeding, cleaning, or brief periods of interaction. This approach also allowed mothers to continue with their daily work, confident that the baby would remain where they were placed. Some historians argue that such practices were not purely about beauty. They suggest that tight swaddling helped keep babies warm in drafty homes, protected them from insects, and made it easier to transport them in slings or baskets. Yet the emphasis on form and proportion is hard to ignore. Descriptions from the time praise children who grow straight and tall without curvature of limb, as though these qualities were the direct result of early binding. The tools for these practices were simple but specialized. Swaddling cloths were often made of linen, chosen for its strength and breathability. For head binding, softer fabrics might be used to avoid chafing, though the pressure could still leave marks on the skin. Wealthier families might commission finely woven bands with decorative stitching, turning even this restrictive process into a display of refinement. Poorer households relied on whatever scraps were available, sometimes cutting old garments into strips. The daily routine of adjusting bindings was a skilled task. Too loose, and the shaping effect would be lost. Too tight, and it could cause discomfort or health problems. Mothers learned to check for signs of swelling or redness, though tolerance for the child's cries was often higher than it would be today. The goal was not to coddle, but to mould. In some places, midwives inspected the bindings during visits, ensuring that the family was following proper technique. Critics of the time did exist, though they were few. Some medical texts warned that restricting movement could weaken muscles or harm the developing body. Religious leaders occasionally condemned the practice as an act of vanity, arguing that a child should be left as God made them. These objections rarely swayed the majority. As with many traditions, the weight of ancestral custom outweighed individual dissent. The cultural persistence of body shaping reveals a great deal about medieval ideas of human form. Perfection was something to be constructed, not simply inherited. This mindset was not limited to children. Adults also shaped themselves through clothing, posture training, and cosmetic practices. In that sense, the treatment of infants was an early step in a lifelong process of aligning the body with societal ideals. I cannot help but think that the quiet patience of those swaddled hours shaped more than just the body. It shaped a certain acceptance of constraint itself. When we look back at these customs, it is easy to judge them as unnecessary or even harmful. Modern understandings of child development emphasize movement, stimulation, and freedom. Yet the medieval approach was grounded in the realities and beliefs of its time. In a world without modern medicine, where appearance could influence marriage prospects, social standing, and even survival, shaping a child's body was seen as an investment in their future. This investment was not without sacrifice. A baby bound tightly in cloth could not reach out to explore their surroundings, roll over, or kick freely. Their world was one of stillness, punctuated by the few moments each day when the bindings were loosened. For the parents, however, the sight of a neatly wrapped child was reassuring. It signaled care, attention, and adherence to tradition. As with many medieval practices, the boundary between care and control was thin. Swaddling and shaping were acts of protection in the eyes of the parents, but they were also acts of imposition. The child's natural form was reshaped to match a collective ideal, a choice made long before the child could have any say. These methods, strange as they may seem now, fit into a larger pattern of medieval child-rearing where the body was guided, moulded, and prepared for its role in society from the very start. And while the bindings would one day be removed, the marks they left, both physical and symbolic, would remain. In the next chapter, we move from shaping the child's body to shaping the world around them, with a focus on the spaces and objects designed to keep them safe in their earliest years. After the strict swaddling of newborns and even the shaping of their heads, attention soon shifted to how they would be fed in the early months of life. In many medieval households, this decision was as much about status and resources as it was about nutrition. For poorer families, a mother was almost always expected to nurse her child, not because it was a sentimental bond, but because there was no spare coin to pay for someone else to do it. The act was woven into her daily rhythm, fitting in between tending to the hearth, keeping the house in order, and, when possible, resting. She would sit in whatever corner of the home was warmest, sometimes near a small fire or a shuttered window, with a folded cloth placed across her lap. In wealthier homes, however, it was common to employ a wet nurse, often a woman from a rural village who had recently given birth herself. These arrangements were made quickly, sometimes even before the noble child was born. The wet nurse would move into the household or live nearby, depending on the agreement. Her role was not just to feed the baby, but to be on call at all hours. Her child might be left in the care of relatives so she could focus entirely on her new charge. It is a little ironic that in some cases, the woman feeding the heir to a great estate lived in far humbler conditions than the child's family dog. The choice of a wet nurse was rarely left to chance. Families believed that the character and health of the nurse would pass to the child through her milk. A robust woman, free of illness and with a good reputation, was prized. Her diet might be adjusted by the employing household to ensure the milk was considered pure and strong. She could be told to avoid certain foods like garlic or onions, believed to taint the flavour, and to eat more grains or dairy. Today, choosing infant formula by brand or flavour seems almost laughably simple compared to the long list of personal and dietary requirements once imposed on a single woman. In some areas, the wet nurse's presence in the home created a quiet hierarchy. She had access to parts of the house others did not, and her role meant she could be near the infant more than the mother herself. This sometimes caused tension, especially if the mother wished to be more involved. There were also whispered concerns that the child might form a deeper bond with the wet nurse than with its own family. This was particularly unsettling for noble mothers who saw the child as both a personal heir and a political asset. For mothers who nursed their children, the experience could be deeply taxing. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and frequent pregnancies meant that her body was under constant strain. In some households, older women would monitor the feeding, believing they could judge whether the child was getting enough. If the infant seemed restless or failed to gain weight quickly, blame could fall on the mother's health or habits. Advice ranged from increasing her portions of bread to resting more during the day, though neither was always possible. There is a certain quiet harshness in how even an act as natural as feeding a baby became a matter for public critique within the home. The environment in which a child was fed was also carefully managed. Some believed that feeding should be done in silence to avoid distracting the spirit of the milk, while others encouraged singing to calm the child. Special chairs were sometimes made for wet nurses or mothers, with high backs and sturdy arms for support. A small wooden footstool might be placed beneath her feet to improve comfort during long sessions. In wealthier homes, the chair could be cushioned and draped with fabric to mark its importance. Milk was considered more than just food. Many believed it carried moral and spiritual qualities. A dishonest or immoral nurse was feared to transmit her faults to the child. This belief was strong enough that some families conducted background checks of sorts, speaking to neighbours about a potential nurse's temperament and behaviour before hiring her. The milk of a healthy, calm, and patient woman was seen as the foundation of a virtuous and intelligent child. In some cases, if a mother could not nurse and no wet nurse was available, substitutes were tried. Broths made from bread soaked in water or animal milk might be used, often given through a cloth or sponge. These alternatives were far less nutritious and increased the risk of illness, but necessity left few choices. The fragility of newborn life meant every feeding decision carried weight, and failure could quickly lead to loss. The presence of a wet nurse also shaped the early social life of the child, because she often stayed with the infant most of the day. The nurse became the first person to interpret the child's cries, moods, and needs. This early bond sometimes lasted into later years, with grown children maintaining affection for the woman who had fed and cared for them in their earliest days. In noble circles, former wet nurses were occasionally given modest pensions or allowed to live on the estate in old age as a token of gratitude. For poorer families, the bond was simpler but no less significant. Nursing was a task done without ceremony, usually in whatever space was available. The child might feed while the mother sat on a low stool by the fire, her other hand stirring a pot or mending clothes. There was no separation between caregiving and the rest of life's work. This blending of roles was simply the reality of survival. While feeding practices have changed greatly, the underlying concerns about nutrition, health, and bonding remain surprisingly familiar. The difference lies in the means available to address them. Where once the choice was between a mother's milk, a hired nurse, or crude substitutes, now it is between dozens of formulas, feeding schedules, and equipment. Yet the debate over what is best for a child still echoes through households everywhere, showing that while methods evolve, the weight of the decision endures. As the child grew and feeding needs shifted, the role of the mother or nurse began to change, but the importance of early nourishment never faded. In the medieval mind, those first months were a shaping force for the body and soul. What followed would draw on the foundation laid in these quiet hours of care, and the next stage of a child's upbringing was already waiting to begin. Once the feeding of newborns through nursing or wet nurses was established, some households also turned to supplemental drinks, especially when there were concerns about the infant's digestion or sleep. These drinks were not given without thought, but the reasoning behind them came from a blend of practical need, inherited belief, and the influence of local tradition. In many homes, the first alternative to milk was a very weak herbal infusion, often made from plants like fennel, chamomile, or mint. The preparation was done by simmering a small handful of the dried herb in water, then straining it until clear. The liquid was left to cool and given in tiny amounts, usually from a spoon or a small cloth dipped into the cup. It was meant to soothe the stomach, ease bloating, and calm fussiness after feeding. It is a little telling that remedies for a baby's discomfort often mirrored those used for grown men after a heavy meal. In wealthier households, these herbal waters were sometimes prepared with imported ingredients, considered more refined and potent. The storage of such plants in small ceramic jars or cloth pouches was common, kept away from dampness and sunlight. Servants or older women in the family would guard the proportions carefully, believing that too strong a brew might do more harm than good. They paid attention to colour, scent, and taste, trusting their senses over written instructions. Another practice, more controversial even in its own time, was giving diluted wine to infants. This was most often done in small rural communities, but was not entirely absent in towns. A mild wine, watered down until very pale, might be given in sips to help the child settle and sleep more quickly. Families saw it as harmless if used sparingly, but others viewed it as risky, especially for a child's still forming body. Still, in regions where wine was part of the daily diet for everyone, its use in child-rearing did not strike many as unusual. By modern standards, the idea of putting wine into a newborn's mouth seems unthinkable, but to them, it was little different from giving a spoonful of sweet syrup. Sometimes, the decision to use diluted wine came when a baby was restless at night, and the household needed peace. A crying child could disrupt the sleep of not just the family, but also servants or others living under the same roof. The belief that a touch of alcohol would calm the infant was passed down through generations, making it a habit that few questioned openly. When a mother could not produce enough milk, or none at all, the most common substitute was thin rice water or barley water. In some areas, a A watery porridge made from oats or wheat was prepared and strained to remove solid bits, leaving a cloudy liquid. This was given warm, and while it filled the stomach, it lacked the full nourishment of milk. These alternatives were a last resort, but for many families, they were the only option. To make these substitutes more palatable, a little honey might be added, although some regions avoided it entirely for fear of illness. The vessels used to feed such drinks varied: a small clay cup, a horn, or a cloth soaked in the liquid and allowed to drip slowly into the baby's mouth. Each method carried its risks of contamination, yet with no concept of germs, the dangers were not understood in the way they are now. The act of preparing these drinks was often handled by the same women who managed the household's cooking and herbal remedies. They took pride in knowing which plants grew best in each season and how to dry and store them. Some even carried their small collection of herbs when moving between households as servants or midwives, building a reputation for their skill. In noble settings, the process could be more elaborate. The herbal drink might be served in a decorated silver or bronze cup, both as a display of wealth and as a token of care. A wet nurse or maid would present the drink with careful formality, making sure the child's head was supported and the amount given was measured. Yet these alternative drinks were not without their critics. Some clergy warned that using wine or even certain herbs on infants could be morally or physically dangerous, interpreting illness or weakness in a child as a possible punishment for imprudent care. Others in the community might quietly judge a mother who relied too heavily on substitutes, seeing it as neglect or a sign she was failing in her maternal role. It is a reminder that even centuries ago, parenting choices could be subject to sharp opinion, much like they are today. Despite the debate, these practices endured because they filled a gap between tradition and necessity. Feeding a child was not always straightforward, and when milk was not enough or was unavailable, families adapted with what they had. The survival of the infant was the ultimate goal, even if the methods seem questionable to modern eyes. As the child grew past those first fragile months, the drinks would change, becoming thicker, sweeter, and closer to the soft foods of early weaning. But for the earliest days, these liquids stood as a bridge between milk and the more solid meals to come, marking yet another stage in the long, careful process of raising a child in the medieval world. In many medieval communities, the naming of a newborn was not simply a formality but a deeply significant event that tied the child to both faith and society. Once the earliest days of life had passed and the infant was considered strong enough, the family began preparations for the naming ceremony. This often took place within the first few weeks, although in some places it happened sooner, especially if there had been concerns about the child's health. The name was not chosen casually. Families consulted with local priests or elders to select one that reflected the virtues they hoped the child would carry. A common practice was to name the infant after a saint, believed to serve as a heavenly protector throughout life. The choice of a saint is often related to the day of birth, or to the family's long-standing devotion to a particular figure in the church. It is almost amusing that for some families, the saint's feast day determined the name more than personal preference. The preparation for the ceremony began days in advance. The home was cleaned thoroughly, and if the event took place in the church, the altar was decorated with flowers, candles, and sometimes embroidered cloths. Invitations, though not formal as in modern terms, were sent by word of mouth, carried from one household to another by relatives or neighbours. The guest list extended beyond close family, often including much of the village, as it was a communal moment to welcome a new life into the fold. On the day itself, the infant was dressed in special garments, often white linen or soft wool, symbolising purity and new beginnings. Even in modest households, an effort was made to prepare something finer than the everyday swaddling. In wealthier families, the garment might be edged with lace or silk trim, passed down through generations. The child was carried to the ceremony by the mother, father, or, in some traditions, the godparents, whose role was also formalised during the event. The godparents were chosen with great care, as they were expected to guide the child's spiritual life and step in if tragedy struck the parents. This was not a purely religious choice, but also a social one, strengthening ties between families. Gifts from the godparents were common, ranging from small tokens like wooden crosses to more valuable items such as silver spoons or embroidered blankets. These items were meant to last, serving as both keepsakes and practical aids. At the heart of the ceremony was the blessing and formal naming, often accompanied by the sprinkling of holy water. This was the child's first introduction to the wider religious community, a moment that was seen as opening the path to salvation. The priest's words were followed closely by all present, and in some places, the name was repeated 3 times to seal its spiritual power. After the religious aspect concluded, attention turned to celebration. In rural areas, this often took place outdoors, with long wooden tables set up for the feast. In towns or noble estates, the event might be held in a hall or courtyard. The meal varied according to resources, but almost always included bread, cheese, and ale, with meat reserved for the better off. By today's standards, the idea of inviting nearly the entire village for what was essentially a baptism party might seem excessive, but it was one of the few times in the year when everyone gathered without work obligations. Music was another common feature. Minstrels or local musicians provided tunes, and people sang songs passed down through generations. Children ran about, and older members of the community used the time to exchange news, arrange trades, or even negotiate marriages. The presence of so many witnesses also served a practical purpose. The community now knew the child's name and godparents, reducing disputes in the future. An important part of the day was the giving of protective gifts to the newborn. These were believed to shield the child from illness, bad luck, or evil spirits. Amulets made from silver, small carved charms, or even simple knots in a strip of cloth were tied to the child's clothing or placed in the cradle. In some areas, a coin was slipped into the baby's hand to ensure future prosperity. These tokens reflected the blending of Christian faith with older folk beliefs that still held strong influence. The feast could last well into the evening. Ale flowed freely, and even those with little to spare contributed something to the table, whether a loaf of bread, a jug of milk, or a handful of berries. In the glow of candlelight or fire, speeches of good wishes were made and blessings were repeated. For the parents, it was both a proud and a humbling moment, as they were now entrusted with raising a child recognized by both church and community. In some regions, a small follow-up gathering took place days later, usually in the home, where close family and godparents met again to discuss the child's upbringing. This was when more personal gifts were given, such as clothing, tools for the future, or even land promises in wealthier circles. The naming day, however, remained the more public and joyous occasion, remembered for its laughter, music, and shared food. Moments like this show that medieval life, often imagined as grim and hard, also held occasions of warmth and togetherness that people looked forward to. With the naming complete and the celebration concluded, the child's place in the community was firmly established. From that day forward, the name would be spoken in prayer, recorded in church registers, and carried through life's milestones. The bond between the family, godparents, and neighbours was reinforced, ensuring that the child grew up in a web of connections that could offer support in both good times and hardship. As the guests departed, carrying the memory of the day with them, the household returned to quieter routines. Yet the echoes of the celebration lingered, and the tokens placed near the child's bed would serve as constant reminders of that first formal welcome into the world. It was a moment that marked not only the start of a life, but also the strengthening of a community bound by shared faith, tradition, and hope for the future. In medieval communities, childbirth was a moment balanced between hope and dread. The chances of survival for both mother and child were far from certain, and families often lived with the knowledge that joy could quickly turn to mourning. Because of this, preparations for the worst began even before labour started. In some households, items for a potential funeral were quietly gathered and stored nearby. A small shroud or burial cloth might be kept folded in a chest, alongside a wooden cross or a candle to be lit during final prayers. These were not morbid acts, but practical measures, shaped by generations of experience. It might seem grim by modern standards, but in their world, readiness for death was simply part of readiness for life. The physical fragility of newborns meant that many parents hesitated to form a strong emotional bond immediately. A mother who had already lost children before might hold back her affection until weeks had passed, waiting to see if the baby's cries would grow stronger and its face fill out with life. Fathers, too, sometimes stayed distant in those early days, partly from superstition and partly from self-protection against grief. This emotional restraint did not mean indifference, but rather a cautious hope born of hard experience. When a death occurred, the response was swift. The body of the child was washed gently, often by the midwife or a close female relative. If the infant had been baptized, prayers of commendation were said. If not, some communities practiced emergency baptism moments before death or immediately afterward, believing it could still secure the child's soul. The shroud or cloth prepared earlier was wrapped around the small body, and in some regions, charms or amulets were placed with it, blending Christian belief with older protective customs. Funeral rites for infants were simpler than for adults, but still deeply communal. The family rarely faced the loss alone. Neighbours arrived to help dig a grave, usually in consecrated ground near the church. Others prepared food for the grieving household, or took on daily chores so the parents could mourn. Compared to today, when loss can feel like a private matter, medieval grief was a shared burden that brought people together physically as well as spiritually. The burial itself was often quiet and brief. A priest said the necessary prayers, sometimes with only immediate family present, sometimes with the whole village gathered. The small mound of earth was marked with a wooden cross, which might later be replaced by a more lasting stone if the family could afford it. For poorer families, the grave marker might be nothing more than a carved symbol or the planting of a small shrub. Afterward, the family entered a period of mourning that could last days or weeks. Black or dark-coloured clothing might be worn, although in some regions, white was the colour of purity and used for mourning children. Meals were subdued and gatherings avoided, yet life could not stop entirely, and for mothers with other children, daily care and work resumed almost immediately. Communal support continued beyond the burial. Women visited the bereaved mother, bringing herbs said to calm the heart or strengthen the body. Men might assist the father with labour in the fields or repairs around the home. Religious services often included prayers for the lost child, and some families made small offerings to the church in the child's name, such as candles or a portion of their harvest. For families who faced repeated losses, coping strategies varied. Some turned to faith with greater intensity, attending more services or going on pilgrimages. Others sought the help of folk healers, believing that unseen forces or curses might be at work. In certain cases, families moved to a new home or even a new village, hoping a change of place would break the pattern of tragedy. Over time, these experiences shaped local customs and beliefs about childbirth. Protective rituals became more elaborate. Midwives adopted stricter cleanliness practices where possible, and naming ceremonies were sometimes held earlier to ensure a child would be recognized by the community and church before illness could strike. Yet despite every precaution, the shadow of high mortality remained. This constant awareness of loss influenced the way people valued life's milestones. Birthdays were rarely celebrated in medieval Europe, but surviving to certain ages, such as the first year or the age of 7, was quietly acknowledged as a blessing. Surviving children often carried with them the weight of siblings who had not lived, and parents sometimes reused the name of a lost child for another, hoping to keep the memory alive. While it might appear harsh from a modern perspective, these customs reflect a world in which resilience was necessary for survival. The emotional distance at first, the readiness for death, and the swift return to daily tasks were all ways of managing the uncertainty that came with every birth. I find it striking how even in the face of repeated grief, communities managed to blend sorrow with acts of solidarity, ensuring that no family bore their loss in isolation. The story of medieval childbirth is not complete without understanding this balance between joy and loss. It shaped not only family life, but the bonds between neighbours, the role of the church, and the customs surrounding both beginnings and endings. The act of preparing a shroud alongside swaddling cloths might seem contradictory, yet in their eyes, it was simply facing all possible outcomes with the same sense of duty and care. As the years passed, a family might speak little of the child they lost, yet certain moments could bring the memory rushing back. The sight of another infant born at the same time, the anniversary of the burial, or the sound of a church bell tolling for someone else's loss. In this way, the reality of high infant mortality was never far from mind, shaping the rhythm of life in ways that modern societies can barely imagine. And in the quiet moments after a burial, when the candles had burned low and the visitors had gone home, a mother might finally allow herself to grieve fully, knowing that tomorrow she would have to rise again and face the duties of her household, carrying both love and loss in equal measure. In the medieval world, childbirth was a moment of both hope and deep uncertainty. Every woman who entered labour stepped into a situation where survival was not guaranteed, and the factors leading to death were often a mixture of poor medical knowledge, unsafe conditions, and harmful customs. The first and perhaps most decisive factor was the absence of proper medical understanding. At that time, midwives and attendants relied on what had been passed down to them orally from older generations. These teachings mixed practical observation with superstition. A midwife might know certain positions that could help in labour, but she might also prescribe rituals or charms instead of physical intervention when complications arise. The understanding of anatomy was incomplete, and there was no clear method for dealing with obstructed labour or prolonged bleeding. Without a foundation of accurate medical science, every decision carried a serious risk. It is disturbing to think that something as simple as the wrong choice made within an hour could mean the end of 2 lives instead of 1. Infection was another deadly enemy. Most births took place at home, where the floor, bedding, and tools were rarely sanitized. Even in wealthier homes, cleaning focused on appearance rather than hygiene. A birthing stool could be wiped down between uses, but it was never truly disinfected. Hands that assisted one delivery might touch another without being washed, spreading invisible threats. If an instrument was used to help extract the baby, it might have been stored wrapped in cloth from the last birth, still carrying harmful bacteria. After birth, any piece of unwashed linen pressed against a wound could become the starting point of a fever that would not relent until death. The idea that such deaths could have been prevented by something as simple as clean water and soap makes these losses even harder to imagine. The handling of difficult births also played a role in maternal deaths. When the baby was in the wrong position, or the labour slowed for too long, attendants might try to force delivery. This could mean pulling on the child's head or limbs, pushing hard on the mother's abdomen, or inserting rough instruments without care. These attempts often caused severe injury to the mother, and in many cases, they failed to save the baby as well. Herbal remedies meant to speed up contractions sometimes caused them to become too strong, leading to heavy bleeding. Without surgical intervention, a mother in distress could deteriorate quickly, her strength draining away before any outside help arrived. The general health of women also affected their chances of surviving childbirth. Many entered labour already weakened by a lifetime of poor nutrition, heavy work, or repeated pregnancies with little recovery time. For a body that had never fully regained its strength after the last birth, even a small loss of blood could be dangerous. In rural areas, the absence of a skilled midwife could make matters worse. A neighbour with little experience might try to assist, not realising the danger signs until it was too late. Cultural beliefs sometimes prevented timely intervention. In many places, it was unthinkable to allow a man into the birthing space, even if he had medical training. The presence of a male healer might have been considered shameful or even sinful. Some communities believed that childbirth pain and danger were part of a divine plan, and trying to avoid them might be seen as interfering with the natural order. Some households hesitated to call for outside help until the labour had gone on for many hours, fearing that news of a difficult birth would become a source of gossip or harm the family's reputation. When a woman died during childbirth, the effect reached far beyond the loss of her own life. If she left behind other children, someone had to step into her role immediately. In wealthier homes, a wet nurse could be hired for the newborn, but this did not replace the mother's care. In poorer homes, the situation was far more dire, as a baby without breast milk often had little chance of survival. The funeral for a woman who had died in childbirth carried a special sadness. Neighbours would gather to pray, sometimes holding vigils for the soul of the mother while the newborn lay swaddled in a cradle nearby, already an orphan. To combat this uncertainty, many families clung to rituals they believed could protect the mother. Charms might be sewn into her clothing before labour began. Holy water could be sprinkled on the birthing stool, and prayers would be whispered before the first contractions. Even though these practices had no effect on infections or dangerous births, they provided comfort in an unpredictable time. It is almost ironic that people put so much trust in symbols and objects, while the real killers were too small to be seen and completely unknown to them. The fear of losing a mother during birth meant that households often prepared for the worst even before labour began. Some families kept burial clothes ready, tucked away in a chest. Others quietly arranged for a neighbour to take in the children if needed. These precautions were never spoken of directly to the woman in labour, but she often sensed them all the same. Looking back now, it is impossible not to see how fragile the balance was between life and death during childbirth in the medieval period. The combination of limited knowledge, unsafe practices, and cultural restrictions created an environment where even a healthy woman could be lost in a matter of hours. It makes me think about how differently birth is approached today, and how much we take for granted the safety provided by modern medicine. And yet, the women of that time still stepped into labour again and again, knowing the risks. Their willingness to face the unknown speaks to a resilience that can still be felt when reading their stories. In the next section, we will see how communities tried to strengthen the odds of survival by protecting both mother and child through customs that blended faith, tradition, and resourcefulness. In the medieval period, the death of a newborn was not an unusual tragedy, yet it always carried a particular weight. Families often went through the entire process of preparing for birth, knowing that the child might not live beyond the first days. When death came so soon, the response was shaped by both religious belief and local custom. For Christian communities, the placement of the child's body was crucial. Many believed that burying a baby close to the church gave its soul greater protection. The churchyard was seen not only as a place of rest, but also as a boundary between the living and the divine. A grave near the walls or under the shadow of the bell tower was thought to keep the child's spirit safe from wandering or from harm in the afterlife. However, there was a painful complication. The church taught that only those who had been baptized could enter heaven. A baby who died before baptism was considered to be in a state outside salvation. This belief led to the creation of specific prayers and ceremonies for these cases. Families might hold a separate vigil, away from the main congregation, to pray for the soul of a child who had not received the sacrament. These gatherings were often quiet and short, with few people present, yet they carried an intense sense of urgency. Some parents begged priests to perform a form of blessing over the small body, even if official baptism had not been given. In certain areas, midwives were authorized to perform an emergency baptism during birth if the child's life seemed in danger, showing how deeply this belief shaped every stage of early life. It is heartbreaking to realize that grief was often mixed with fear for the fate of the baby's soul, rather than only mourning the body itself. The burial of a newborn was often marked by objects meant to accompany or protect them. In poorer families, this might be a simple carved wooden toy, a small cross, or a piece of cloth that had belonged to the mother. In wealthier homes, a silver charm, a rosary, or a small saint's medal could be placed inside the coffin. These items had both symbolic and emotional value. They were a sign of care, a way to send the child into the next life with a piece of home. The coffin itself was usually very small, sometimes little more than a wooden box lined with linen. In some cases, the box was wrapped in an extra layer of cloth before burial, almost as though the family were tucking the child in for sleep. The choice of burial location could also be influenced by old folk traditions. In some rural areas, infants were buried at crossroads or under a large tree if they had died before baptism, reflecting older pre-Christian customs about guiding spirits. These practices often existed quietly alongside official church rules, tolerated as long as they did not openly challenge religious authority. Such blending of customs shows how families tried to reconcile their faith with older community beliefs. Mothers and fathers grieved differently. For mothers, the loss was often both physical and emotional, especially if the death occurred within days of the birth. The body still bore the marks of labour, the breasts produced milk. Yet the baby was gone. Fathers carried their weight, managing the funeral arrangements and sometimes shielding the mother from the practical details. In some cases, fathers would take on the role of digging the small grave themselves, a final act of care that also marked their mourning. The community played a role in these moments. Neighbours might help prepare the grave or provide food for the family. Women who had lost children themselves often came to sit with the grieving mother, offering quiet companionship rather than words. Children's funerals were usually short and simple, lacking the longer processions given to adults. Still, the image of a tiny coffin carried through the village was one that remained in the memory of everyone who saw it. Even though infant death was common, it was never treated as something unimportant. Many families kept a record of the births and deaths, sometimes in the margins of prayer books or on a scrap of parchment stored in a chest. This act preserved the child's existence within the family's memory. The naming of the child, if it had taken place before death, was repeated in prayers for years afterward. In some traditions, parents would give the same name to a later-born child as a way of honouring the one who had died. It is almost strange to think how these brief lives could leave such a long shadow in the lives of those left behind. Religious art from the period also reflected this part of life. Frescoes, carvings, and manuscripts sometimes depicted angels carrying small swaddled figures upward, a visual hope that the child's spirit would be cared for in heaven. These images offered comfort in a way that words could not. Even for those who doubted the strict rules about baptism and salvation, the thought of their baby being cradled by divine hands brought some peace. In addition to formal burial rites, there were also quiet personal rituals. A mother might keep a lock of hair tied with thread, hidden among her personal belongings. A father might carve a small wooden figure representing the child and place it in a private corner of the home. These acts were not part of official religion but served as deeply personal connections between the living and the dead. Over time, the handling of infant death influenced wide community customs. Villages that experienced high rates of newborn mortality often developed special sections in their cemeteries just for children. These areas were sometimes marked by smaller stones or crosses, a visible reminder of how many families had faced the same loss. It created a shared space for grief, where parents could visit and know they were not alone in their sorrow. Looking back, the medieval approach to infant death reveals a balance between acceptance and hope. Death was seen as part of the natural order, yet there was always an effort to secure a safe passage for the child's soul and to honour its place in the family. The blend of religious rites, folk customs, and personal gestures formed a network of meaning that helped families cope with a loss that was both common and deeply personal. It makes me reflect on how modern grief often lacks the shared rituals that once offered comfort in such moments. The care given to these small bodies and the thought put into their burial show that, even in an age where survival was uncertain, the value of a life was not measured by its length. In the next section, we will turn to the role of midwives and the many responsibilities they carry, from delivering babies to guiding families through the most difficult moments of birth and loss. In the medieval world, childbirth was never simply a single event. For most women, it marked the beginning of years of physical and emotional strain. With no effective means of birth control, pregnancies followed one after another, often with barely a year in between. This constant demand on the body left little time for recovery, leading to chronic exhaustion and a steady decline in health. A woman might carry one child while still breastfeeding another, her body pulled in every direction without pause. Food, though valued for recovery, was rarely abundant, and rest was a luxury few could afford. Over time, the effects became impossible to ignore. Weakened muscles, persistent back pain, and pelvic injuries were accepted as a natural outcome of childbirth. Tears and damage to the body during delivery often healed poorly, if at all, leaving discomfort that could last for decades. It is almost darkly amusing how medieval society treated these injuries as a badge of normal womanhood, as if a lifetime of discomfort was simply part of fulfilling one's duty. Without knowledge of surgical repair or physical therapy, women learned to adapt to their limitations, hiding the extent of their pain from others. For those who faced especially difficult births, the consequences were worse. Infections from unclean tools or poor postnatal care could cause permanent damage to the heart or other organs. Some women lost mobility or developed chronic illnesses that shape the rest of their lives. Even noble women, who had access to better nutrition and more assistance during recovery, were not immune to these outcomes. A title or wealth could not protect the body from the risks of childbirth. Life expectancy for women reflected this constant danger. Many never reached old age, not because of war or famine, but because their bodies simply wore out from repeated pregnancies and deliveries. Men, though exposed to other risks, often lived longer because they did not endure this relentless physical toll. By modern standards, it is startling to think that childbirth was one of the most common causes of early death for women, no matter their social rank. The emotional toll was just as heavy. Losing children was tragically common, and many mothers endured that grief more than once. The fear of loss often shaped how they approached new pregnancies. Some mothers, especially those who had already buried infants, hesitated to form strong attachments to newborns until they were sure the child would survive. This quiet self-protection was a survival mechanism, even if it was never openly discussed. It makes me think about how today, women can choose when and how often to have children, with time to recover between births, a freedom that would have been unimaginable then. Support networks could ease the burden slightly. Relatives, neighbours, and midwives helped with childcare, cooking, and household work, especially in the early weeks after birth. In rural villages, community bonds meant that women rarely faced recovery entirely alone. Still, these supports were temporary, and the underlying cycle of pregnancy and recovery continued until menopause brought it to an end. Physically, the signs of strain were visible by middle age. Many women developed a stooped posture from years of carrying children, bending over work, and enduring untreated injuries. Their skin aged faster, their hands grew rough, and their movements slowed. Chronic pain could make sleeping difficult, so fatigue became a constant companion. In poorer households, malnutrition worsened the problem, as mothers often gave the best food to their husbands or children first, leaving themselves with what remained. Religious teachings played a powerful role in how women viewed their situation. The church framed motherhood as a sacred calling, with suffering seen as part of God's plan. This belief gave some women comfort and a sense of purpose. For others, it was simply another reason to endure without complaint, reinforcing the idea that their bodies existed primarily to bear and raise children. The consequences of maternal decline extended beyond the individual. Families had to adjust when a mother could no longer manage heavy work or when she died in childbirth. In some cases, fathers remarried quickly to ensure the household had someone to care for the children. Older daughters often stepped into their mother's role, sometimes abandoning their own futures in the process. These personal tragedies rippled outward, affecting the stability of the household and the community. The legacy of these women is often hidden in history, overshadowed by the deeds of kings and nobles. Yet, it was their endurance that kept families alive through war, famine, and plague. Their struggles, often silent, built the foundation of daily life in the medieval world. Recognizing their sacrifices means understanding that survival in those centuries was not just about swords and politics, but about the quiet, constant labor of motherhood. And so we end this journey through the realities of medieval childbirth. It has been a story of resilience, pain, and the unspoken costs borne by women in a time when survival was never guaranteed. May you find rest tonight with a deeper respect for their strength, and may your sleep be peaceful. Good night.